And that's all we can recount about the Fifth Age. The Sixth Age, also known as Setux, has a more intact history than that of any other age. The wizened old elf told Hoplite as his helmeted head hung low over the root table. They had laid out several plates on the table before Hoplite, each stacked tall with different cuts of meat, every berry he could think of, and all kinds of wine. A broken bar. He had never tasted wine before in his life. He knew it was a broken bar. Was it alcoholic? Hoplite had never been allowed to drink any kind of alcoholic beverage, so his knowledge of such things was limited. The old elf man seated next to him had to be older than the Harkmother or even Theopalu, for he was well wrinkled and bent at the back, with a long scraggly white beard that practically hung over his knees. The elf was wearing a dusty grey robe as opposed to an alum leaf outfit. It matched his professed occupation as a law keeper. This old elf, Mangwin was his name, has been insistent on coming to speak of Ahkoolis to the new outworlder. Mangwin had gone unchallenged by the surrounding elves for hours now, all the way up until the sun had finally set. Hoplite welcomed the old elf's attention. After all, when Mangwin had come to speak with Hoplite, the other elves bothering him had all backed off to let them speak. From the Mangwin had led a tired Hoplite to this table, toward the center of the crowd. Hoplite had opted to simply fall to his knees next to one of the chairs, as his great weight would have been far too much for the feeble wood to bear. Listening to Mangwin speak was interesting. He was a goldmine for intel on Ahkoolis. But oh, how heavy Hoplite's eyes were a broken bar, and how calming Mangwin's aged voice was. Fighting to stay awake had proven to be a difficult battle, but the rewards of intel were well worth the effort. In the Sixth Age, Ahkoolis was ruled over by a dwarven civilization known as the Ramai. Mangwin continued. We know that they ruled over the other races with an iron fist, and that their rulers were immortal. These rulers were known as the 10, and there is evidence to suggest that these 10 had been afflicted with an advanced form of vampirism, as several preserved Ramai corpses have been found to possess sharp fangs, something non-standard for dwarven skeletons from any other age. These Ramai tombs seem to have been reserved for only the highest ranking in Ramai society. A broken bar. The more lavish the tomb, the higher chance of a vampiric skeleton, Mangwin said, stroking his long beard as he leaned a little closer to Hoplite's helmet. Are you awake? Hoplite hesitated before answering affirmative. Mangwin nodded, knitting his brows together before wetting his lips. That was the last anyone has seen a pure-blooded dwarf, vampiric or not. The modern-day dwarves you see now are the result of their diminished population interbreeding with humans at the beginning of the Seventh Age, which is why they are both larger and shorter-lived than they used to be. Vampire dwarves. That sounded preposterous, absolutely unthinkable, and outright stupid. Every bit of intel is potentially important. Never write off information that seems superfluous at a glance. The voice of Commander echoed from the past. Hoplite cursed himself for having not followed that advice as well as he should have when he had first landed on Ahkoolis. Vampire dwarves from 4 ages ago didn't seem all too important. True, a broken bar, but Commander would have kept it in mind just in case. After all, what if something relevant to these alleged vampire dwarves came up in the future? Hoplite should learn all he could about these Sixth Age Ramai from Mangwin, if not to help engross himself in Ahkoolis's history, then to keep away the flocks of elves with their annoying questions for longer. You said there aren't any more pure-blooded dwarves left? Hoplite asked. Was this because their population was targeted specifically by the Pillarborn who was about to ascend in that age? Mangwin smiled at Hoplite, much like a tutor to a favored student before answering. Yes, that's exactly right. Mangwin confirmed, wetting his lips again. Oz, the now pillar god of justice, in his madness, committed genocide against the Ramai civilization for all the wrongs they had committed against not only him, but the rest of the world. Hoplite knitted his brow and shook his head. How is it justice to genocide an entire race? You said Oz ascended to be the god of justice, but genocide isn't selective. Oz would have slaughtered non-combatants to decimate a population in such a way. Hoplite said, the tiredness in his voice barely suppressed. In his mind, condemning dwarven genocide seemed almost like hypocrisy. After all, Terna had wiped out entire species of aliens for the resources their planets possessed. Hardly justice certainly, but the needs of mankind were ever growing. Many soldiers seemed to think that hoplites served Terna in this way a broken bar, yet that was far from the truth. Hoplites have never been made for such a task. A hoplite took many roles in the 8th Arm, true, but they were always used for more important operations than planet clearing. Genocide was the job of the 6th Arm, a broken bar also known as Dark Watch. Mangwin knitted his brows as his frown deepened. Indeed, a broken bar's sense of justice had been completely twisted by his madness. Throughout his life, the Ramai had oppressed not only your kind, the humans, but every other race on Ahkoolis. In his diminished mental state, it is theorized that Oz had believed himself to be doing right by the world. Only by exterminating all the dwarves could Ahkoolis finally be free of the Ramai broken bar, which he did to great effect. Mangwin said, running fingers through his long beard. Hoplite stared at the long drape of hair hanging off Mangwin's face for a moment. No other elf he had seen had any kind of facial hair. Could it be possible that Mangwin possessed some dwarven heritage? He was a tad on the shorter end, but wait, why was Hoplite so curious about this? Perhaps it tied into what Mangwin had said earlier about the dwarves intermixing with humans. But there were other races that existed. Why not interbreed with elves as well? Were dwarves only capable of reproducing with human beings? Do not ask about sex. He remembered Lance's words. Hoplite would not ask about sex. He would wait until the party was over. For now, he had another question in mind, one about the Pillarborn. What makes Pillarborn go insane? Hoplite asked. Physically they seem beyond healthy. Mangwin paused a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts before taking a deep breath. The power of their divine blood grows as they perform greater and greater feats. This divinity, however, has a drawback. Blood from the mortal and the divine conflict, and while it enhances their bodies, it slowly degrades their mental well-being. It always ends the same way, assuming the Pillarborn survives to reach apotheosis. Once the godling reaches their apex, the very brink of godhood, they are always taken by what is known as the madness of ascension. Mangwin explained the mixed bloods of mortal and god are at constant war with one another, but naturally, their divine halves always prevail over their mortality, thus triggering ascension to a pillar. The elves standing around Hoplite and Mangwin seemed to grow somewhat irate as Mangwin wet his lips. They glared at the elder with narrowed eyes, as if to say, you've had your time with him, let us have a turn. Mangwin took notice of this, and rolled his eyes, shaking his head while running a hand through his long beard. I fear that they wish me gone. The peace dulls slowly as the night goes on, so their patience is now beginning to show some cracks. Do you feel it, Hoplite? Mangwin asked the dulling of the peace. Hoplite simply shook his head. He might have felt just a tad less lazy, but otherwise, his instincts only screamed at him to sleep or eat. We may take a break if you wish, you seem tired. I'm sure you could get away with a short snooze, Mangwin told him, the words sounding like pure honey to his ears. A nap sounded wonderful, shut off the noise receptors to his suit and just a broken bar pass out. But then he'd lose out on potentially crucial intel. Just a couple more questions, a broken bar, then he would take a quick rest. Why aren't there more gods? He asked. Mangwin giving a pleased smile as Hoplite continued in a drowsy tone. There've been 9 ages before this one, but you say that there are 12 pillar gods. You said earlier that there are always about 200 Pillarborn at the end of each age. Shouldn't there be more gods than just 12? Of course, Hoplite assumed that not every Pillarborn could survive to ascension, but surely there should have been more than just 12. Only one, Mangwin said, lifting a finger. There can only be one that can ascend at the end of the age. Only when all other contenders are slain can one rise to the pillars. The contest up until the apotheosis is destructive. Yes, a godling war tears Ahkoolis as under a broken bar, but the ascension itself is what brings an end to the age that gave a Pillarborn life. So why are there 12, and not 9? Hoplite asked. The first 3 pillar gods created Ahkoolis. They never participated in the contest to become deities, they simply were. Mangwin answered, the first age came to an end when the Pillarborn paid a broken bar, and every age has followed suit. When demigods are born, it is a sign of the end times. So Pillarborn only appear when it's the end of an era, Hoplite said with a nod. his eyes slowly beginning to shut as he spoke. Hoplite then stood from his seat, the surrounding elves staring at him hopefully, likely waiting for him to turn around to greet them. Hoplite engaged the maglocks to his armor and went limp, the phalanx suit not budging an inch from its standing position. To outside observers, Hoplite looked to be standing tall before the table, but in truth, he was getting ready to take a nap. He was too tired to stay awake now. A broken bar Mangwin's voice was simply too relaxing to bear, even over the noise of the surrounding party. Mangwin lifted an eyebrow but continued, "Yes, meaning that this is the end of Decuma," he said after a short pause, "but I have hope now. After all, no mortal, outworlder or no, has ever slain a Pillarborn. Perhaps you were broken bar." He paused, just as Hoplite's eyes fully shut. "Perhaps you can save us, Hoplite." Michael laughed as he chugged back another glass of wine, that happy head feel growing ever heavier as the dizzy water sat warmly in his stomach. Only one of the two elf girls remained from the pair that had essentially kidnapped him earlier. They had been at it for a few hours, following Michael around the party to different tables, with both gradually looking more irritated as they went. Michael knew why they were mad. After all, he still hadn't confirmed or denied that he was an outworlder. He breathed in the cool night air, relieved that the elves had seen fit to keep the party lit with floating blue orbs of light. Those orbs kept the looming darkness of night at bay, well away from Michael. With how at ease he was, that darkness surrounding the root bowl seemed less threatening, like a small spider you'd find outside. No real point in squishing a spider if it was outdoors, right? No point stressing over darkness if it wasn't bothering him. Michael found a chair before the root table, plopping down in it with a drunken giggle before grabbing a plate and slapping a still steaming steak atop it. If only Nasty Nate were here to party with him. A broken bar Michael again found himself hoping that somehow, Nathan had survived. He knew deep down though that he shouldn't get his hopes up. It never ended well when he did. "Michael," the elf girl asked, leaning atop a nearby root table, right next to a gigantic pile of leaves. Summer alum leaves, relatively small ones that had fallen from the great tree ever looming overhead. Apparently, they made for great appetizers on their own. But Michael wouldn't be munching on raw leaves anytime soon. He wasn't no damn dinosaur. The meat they had laying around on the tables had been just fine. A good steak how 5 did wonders for an empty gut. Why waste time on leaves? The elf girl cleared her throat loudly, staring with an irritated intensity that made Michael somewhat nervous. She locked eyes with Michael, twirling the wine in her glass before continuing. "What is your world like? Did you and Hoplite know each other before he arrived on Ahkoolis?" she asked, leaning ever so slightly closer to Michael while maintaining that almost glare. Crazy chick didn't even blink as she mad-dogged Michael, and that was when he remembered that elves could read your mind or some crap. Wait, not minds, emotions. It required eye contact though from what he could remember, so he not so subtly looked to his armored feet. "Man, I'll tell ya what, that wine went straight to my head," Michael told her. "Real good stuff. Sure Muro would have loved it." Michael thought he heard a small irritated huff from her. He had already been well informed about Muro from the other elf girl that had been with them before she had vanished into the crowd. He had no idea why the second girl had left a broken bar. Maybe she was going to go look for Lance? Michael wasn't sure if Lance would spill the beans on him. But if this milling crowd was anything to go by, it would be like finding a needle in a very large shifting haystack. "He would have," she said simply. "You and Hoplite must have gone through much together ever since you both landed in our forest." Michael lifted a brow, looking back up into her eyes to show her the confusion he felt. She seemed taken aback for a moment as she read his eyes. She didn't know that Michael and Hoplite had crashed separately. A broken bar. Maybe the confusion on display in his eyes could help dissuade the elf from interrogating him any further. Michael stood, and leaned in closer, looming over her with a frown. If the surrounding crowd of elves took offense at their sudden closeness, they did not show it. Indeed, they seemed well into the drink at this point, laughing and shoving one another or eating and singing, sometimes all of these things at once. "Why are you bothering me so much?" Michael asked. "You got something to gain?" "That's none of your business," she huffed, turning her head away from him. Michael grinned. "And where I come from is none of yours, hun," he told her in a calm tone. A sound like that of an almost suppressed growl emanated from her throat, and Michael couldn't help but snicker at her frustration. The peace he had felt seemed to have faded just a tad as the night had carried on. Maybe that was why she was getting irritated. Her patience had to be wearing thin after the runaround Michael had been giving her. "Yeah, broken bar," she began slowly after taking another small sip of wine. "I just want to know, why did you try giving me that crap about the Hark? Me tellin' you already then. What do you got to gain from knowing? You gonna harvest my organs or something?" Michael asked, causing her to gasp in shock, purple eyes going wide. "I guess the allure of your broken bar otherworldly guts got to attract some weirdos. They'd probably pay ya real well." "I get it. Get me drunk, lead me away from the party with some eye batin, harvest my organs." "Well, it's not the first time someone's tried, but you're by far the worst at it." The wine glass shattered in her hand, wine spilling down her hand and forearm as a vein popped on her forehead. "I don't want to do any such thing," she spat, drawing the attention of the surrounding crowd. "Just forget it," she finished, casting the wine glass to the dirt and turning from him sharply. Some of the crimson that dribbled down to the dark soil from her hand wasn't just wine or broken bar. Michael grabbed her hand, eliciting a shocked cry from her before he pulled her back to him, lifting her hand to his face to inspect her palm. She struggled to pull away from Michael, but his grip was iron. "Quit," Michael told her flatly. "You got a shard stuck in your hand. Here, sit down." She sputtered almost unintelligibly as he leaned over her hand, the surrounding crowd now still around the two of them. Michael heard some confused muttering from the observers. Maybe at first they thought he was being aggressive, but seeing him scrutinize her now clearly bleeding hand likely stopped anyone from coming to pull Michael away. "Alrighty, got to pull it out right quick," Michael told her, her face going pale as she located the shard in the center of her palm. "Calm down, just a small piece." "What's your name?" Michael asked her. She blinked, looking up from the shard of glass in her hand, which was most certainly not a small piece. In truth, that was what Michael had wanted her to do. No point in her staring at it after all, that and he really didn't know her name. "Lena Broken Bar," she said quietly, keeping her eyes firmly above her hand. With that, he ripped out the glass shard, tossing it onto the table as Lena gave a small cry of pain. Without a word, Michael grabbed one of the pitchers from the table. After confirming that it was indeed water and not wine, began pouring it onto the wound. She drew breath in sharply through her teeth, the water rinsing off the wound. After that was done, he set the pitcher back on the table and reached into his tack pouch. After a bit of digging, he pulled out a bandage roll and some cotton. He wasn't a medic, but he knew that it was all right to pack an open wound as long as it wasn't on the torso. Michael heard the partygoers go on about their revelry as Michael finished wrapping up the bandage around Lena's hand, putting what was left of the roll back into his pouch with a smile. "Good as new. Don't go squishing glass." "What the hell were ya thinking?" Michael asked. "I was just joking about harvesting my organs." Lena lightly squeezed her hand, her frown deepening as she refused to meet his gaze. "Thank you, I apologize for the inconvenience," she said after a moment, "but you angered me greatly." "Look Lena," Michael said in a slightly slurring voice, "ya gotta quit being shady about getting what you want." She frowned, staring deeply into his eyes a moment before looking away. "We need an outworlder's blood," Lena said quietly. "I and my sister study the bodies formed from Zod's blood. A broken bar. We have intrinsic knowledge of most races' biologies, including humans, but no one has ever studied outworlder biology before." "Really?" "The blood was just the first thing we were going to ask for. We want to do a full physical exam, take some hair, toenails, booges, whatever." Michael frowned, leaning back in his chair as he stared deep into Lena's eyes. He may not have been able to read emotions, but he could tell that she was dead serious. Did they have some kind of magic microscope or something? What was the purpose of this? Were they gonna make Michael clones? There was only room for one space dumbass on Ahkoolis. Michael didn't want any more of himself running around. Unless this was just purely for education, a broken bar, and she did say a full examination. What did that entail exactly? He stroked his beard a moment, biting his cheek as he thought what would be so wrong with letting some elven cuties play nurse on him. Well, a broken bar first off. Maybe they wanted to harvest his organs after all. Lead him away and cut him up. Again, not the first time someone had tried. He'd maintain caution for now, till he was sure they weren't after his giblets. Why were you being so shady about it? Michael asked Lena, lifting a brow. Because you don't open a conversation with a "Hey, can I have some blood?" That would have sent you running for sure. We wanted to butter you up. Lead with some casual conversation about frogs or some such before determining your origin. Lena told him, we a broken bar aren't exactly good at social functions. Yeah, I can tell, Michael said flatly, refilling his glass with more wine before downing it all in one go. How much blood? Michael asked in a slow slur, his thoughts becoming muddy in his growing drunkenness. Wait. Had Hoplite ordered him to not get drunk? Michael couldn't remember a broken bar. Surely the big guy would cut him a little slack, right? Just a single drop, she said urgently, leaning close to him. That's all we want if you're unwilling to do the examination. My sister may have gone to ask Hoplite himself if he would be willing to submit himself for examination. He's gonna say no for sure, Michael said with a shake of his head. If she goes asking him that, 37 will probably think she wants to kill him. A broken bar. We better go find her before she gets the chance to ask. Hoplite's eyes opened slowly, seeing madness surrounding his position on all sides. Elves danced around him in a strange rhythm, like that of a beating heart. The maglocks had done their job to keep him standing a broken bar, but he was not where he had been before. Now he was much further away from the root tables, closer to the center of the tiny valley. How he had been moved, Hoplite had no idea. He re-enabled the suit's sound receptors, resulting in his ears being immediately assaulted with a cacophony of slurred singing and the beats of drums. His breathing quickened, his fight response nearly taking over instantly when he realized that an elf woman had begun climbing up his arm. Hoplite blinked again when she straddled his shoulders, spilling wine from a glass. She clutched down on his helmet as she let out a yell of triumph. The surrounding elves all cheered as Hoplite turned off his maglocks, nearly stumbling as he began standing on his own power once more. The elf girl squealed as his hands reached up to grab her by the waist, lifting her up into the air before setting her on the ground before him. The elves surrounding them all stopped a moment to stare in awe before shouting for Hoplite to join them in their revelry. The elf girl then turned to face him, her face a tint of drunken red. She slowly stumbled toward him, falling into his armor and bracing her hands against his torso. He frowned as she wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her body against his in a most unprofessional manner. "Hey hero," the woman hiccuped, "how's about I take ya back to my tree? I'll give ya a night you'd never forget." Hoplite sneered as he placed a hand against her forehead, gently shoving her away from him. She tilted back with a laugh, falling back into the open arms of an elf man who began singing as he stood her up once more. Hoplite shook his head and yawned, that feeling of peace still present but not nearly as overpowering as it had been before. He should find Michael or Lance, but where would they be in this milling mass of shifting bodies? Michael would be easy to pick out. His black tungsteel armor would make him stick out like a sore thumb. Lance though? There were a lot of elves with black hair like Lance had a broken bar. In fact, the more he strained to find her, the more he noticed that elves only seemed to have two hair colors, blonde and black. With how many black-haired elves there were dancing about, it would be very hard for him to find her. Then again, Lance was very tall for a woman, and these elven girls seemed to be standard human height. That would narrow it down a fair margin. Now he just needed to find her, or perhaps he would find Michael first. He sighed as he began gently pushing his way through the crowd. He had to fend off several dozen elves from attempting to draw him into a dance, shoving them away as gently as he was able as to not accidentally kill them. Somehow this had ended up turning into a game for the elves, several going out of their way to get in his path or to latch onto him before Hoplite promptly pushed them away. Normally this would have annoyed him to nearly the point of murder, but the piece, while weaker, still had a hold on him. His stomach grumbled when at one point he passed by a root table, still stacked with plenty of still steaming meats, After a few dozen passes through the area trying to find either Lance or Michael, Hoplite finally caved to his desire. He had seen these elves partake in the food several times to no effect. This food wasn't poisoned in any way. Even if it was, he could not be killed by it, so what was there to worry about? He approached a table, pushing several elves out of the way until he was standing over a massive pile of steaks. Hoplite could barely restrain himself after he removed his helmet, magnetizing it to his hip before grabbing a cut from the table and taking a bite. The meat practically fell apart in his mouth, the juice aiding the steak's descent down his throat. Then Hoplite ate another, and another, a broken bar and another. The plate had been stacked as high as an elf was tall, but by the time Hoplite was done with it, a broken bar, well, it was all gone. With his stomach full, he sighed, grabbing a pitcher of water. He then raised it to his mouth before he began chugging, the surrounding elves cheering Hoplite on as he began downing it. His golden eyes widened when he realized that the taste on his tongue wasn't anything like water. It reminded him of an old grape he had as a trainee. A broken bar. This had to be wine. It tasted a broken bar. It was a broken bar. Fantastic. The sweet bitterness that flowed down his gullet urged him to drink more. The alien taste being unlike anything he'd experienced before. He couldn't stop himself from finishing the pitcher, slamming it back down to the table with a gasp as a sudden dizziness suddenly overtook him. Wine was alcoholic, wasn't it? He needed to activate his blood filtration system to get rid of this sudden intoxication. With how quickly a hoplite could metabolize food and drink, the alcohol had nearly immediately gone to his head. A broken bar. It felt good, he realized. Very good. A broken bar. Would it be so bad to keep feeling this way for just a little bit longer? A small smile crept across his face as he stumbled back from the table with a hiccup, his vision doubling as he began meandering through the crowd. Elves latched onto him again, but this time, Hoplite could hardly bring himself to shove them away, instead allowing them to pile onto him as they saw fit. Soon, this became a new game to them. And soon Hoplite was dragging 10 cleaners with him as he continued to search for a broken bar. Search for a broken bar. What was he doing? Hoplite then giggled for the first time in centuries, lifting his arms to allow more elves to hang from them as he continued to walk, spinning in circles as he went. Everything turned into a blur after that. Lance was very drunk. She was dimly aware of that fact as she twirled through the crowd madly, following the beat of the drums with each motion. The opening hours of the party had gone as expected, with the sharing of tales for the deceased and the beginnings of drink. Humble beginnings, compared to how the mass of bodies in the root bowl sloshed like a liquid to and fro. One could almost believe that the dozens of elves in the bowl really were a sloshing fluid at a distance, with some drops spilling out of and into the container as elves climbed in or out to attend different parties. The noise was near deafening around the elm tree. There was no doubt about it, this had to be the biggest death day since the end of the Ahkoolis expansion war 300 years ago. Lance dearly hoped that she wouldn't black out during this. She always woke up in the strangest places afterward. A broken bar like the pig pen incident 20 years ago. Thankfully no one had found her before she awoke. Lance would have been made fun of for the rest of her long life for passing out in the mud cuddling with pigs. It wasn't her fault really, it was the pigs' mistake for being so damned adorable. So what if she practically buried herself in them that night? She shook her head. Lance's thoughts were hardly staying on track anymore. That was one of the great things about being so drunk. She couldn't get hung up on past embarrassments. A broken bar like the pig pen incident. Wait. Now she was thinking in circles. Or was it a triangle? The pig pen had been a triangle, right? No wait, it had been a rectangle. She bumped into something hard, falling to the dirt with a drunken giggle before looking up to see what she had collided with. Lance's eyes widened a margin when she saw that it was Hoplite. A broken bar, and he was. No, he couldn't be. Hoplite did not smile. He was physically incapable of it. Or at least he was supposed to be. Why were there so many elves holding on to him? Hoplite then finally took notice of her, those golden eyes widening a margin before he shook his head. He then leaned down closer to her, those eyes searching her face for a long moment before he smiled again. He smiled "Sorry about that, Lance," Hoplite said in a slightly slurring tone. "A broken bar. Think I was looking for you?" Hoplite then began peeling off the elves that held onto him, the cleaners all groaning in agitation as he displaced them. When he was finally done, he offered a hand to her, and it was then that Lance remembered that she was still sitting in the dirt. She took the proffered hand, his metal gauntlet entombing her hand as he lifted her from the ground. "I think you are broken bar," Lance hiccuped. "I think I was loofing for yet you a broken bar. Got lost, had to drink tar keep hydrator at a broken bar, hydrated at a broken bar liquid," she said smartly. Hoplite gave a slow nod. "After a moment you drank the wine near broken bar," he said with slow blinks. "I've been a broken bar commandeering beverages as well, a broken bar PFFT." Lance spat. "I can still uned first hand ya ain't drank," she continued in what must have seemed to be stunning articulation. Lance had been told several times by snickering comrades that she sounded incredibly intelligent when drunk. Surely Hoplite was impressed by how wise she was. Indeed, he nodded his head, scrunching his brow in apparent confusion as his underdeveloped sober brain tried to comprehend her words. This would simply not do. He had to be on her level of intellect for them to have a proper dialogue. Without a word, she tugged on his gauntlet, failing to move him even an inch. Hoplite frowned for a moment before allowing himself to be tugged away toward a root table, where several pitchers of wine sat. They came before the table, Lance sweeping away the crowd of elves with offensive slurs and ineffective shoves to make a small pocket in the mass of bodies. When the area was clear, Lance leaned over the table, smelling the different pitchers until she located the brand she was looking for. A pungent aroma like sweet boiled honey, with a deep crimson color that was red one second, black the next. This was definitely the Anya Broken Bar Dragon's Blood wine. Not actual dragon blood of course, but well strong enough to ascend any man no matter how big his liver was to drunken godhood. She lifted the whole pitcher, proffering it to Hoplite with fire in her green eyes. He looked down at it, quirking a brow before taking it from her. In his hands, it looked almost like a normal cup, as opposed to an entire pitcher of wine. He would just take a few sips and be done with it. No one, not even someone of Hoplite's great size, should be able to withstand drinking more than a few mouthfuls of dragon blood. A single cup was enough to get even a dwarf drunk. Hoplite looked down to the pitcher, then back up to Lance. She offered her best grin as motivation, or maybe reassurance. Lance could not really tell. Hoplite blinked again, shrugged, and then proceeded to down the whole thing in one go. Lance stared, mystified by what Hoplite was doing. He didn't even sputter when the wine hit his tongue, the power of the dragon blood not enough to stop Hoplite from attempting to down the whole pitcher. The surrounding elves all stared, jaws agape as he finished the entire thing, stumbling over to the table and setting the empty jug atop it. A loud belch emanated from Hoplite, and then Lance heard a strange noise from Hema Broken Bar. She approached, concerned as that strange low growl slowly grew louder. Was he getting angry? Was he an angry drunk? That was the worst possible outcome, if he was that way. Then a loud laugh then boomed out from Hoplite, and he promptly fell flat on his back with a loud crash. His cheeks had turned a deep shade of red, and he looked up at Lance with a smile. "Is this Shwashama Broken Bar ya?" Hoplite said wisely. Lance nodded in satisfaction. Now, Hoplite was well and properly drunk and could communicate with Lance properly. "Ya must stand up Hopshaw Broken Bar," Lance told him sagely, placing her hands on her knees as she leaned over him. Hoplite blinked in confusion a moment before nodding. "Affirmative, ya Broken Bar," Hoplite told her in a slurring monotone. When he finally rose to his feet, he let out a long sigh before asking, "Wash a shot?" "Pick me you," Lance said, lifting her arms toward him. After approximately 3 seconds, Hoplite complied, lifting Lance from the air like she weighed little more than a doll. For a brief instant, she remembered the rabbit he had brutalized in the forest, her blood freezing as Hoplite had her in his grasp. When he did not eat her, she relaxed in his hands, letting out a sigh of relief. He held her at eye level with him a moment before Lance remembered what it was she wanted him to do. "Spin me," she ordered in a commanding tone, Spin me fast. Another 3 seconds, then Hoplite nodded. The crowd surrounding them had hardly shifted since this interaction began, the onlookers clearly interested in what was about to transpire. The world was already spinning before Hoplite began swinging her around. Slowly at first, before he turned into a practical tornado. Lance laughed as he spun, maintaining his position before the table without even the slightest deviation. His gauntlets were cold beneath her arms, but the alcohol helped her simply not care. If they were surrounded by mattresses, Lance would have asked Hoplite to toss her into one. But maybe she would still die if he did that. Wait, there were no mattresses on our broken bar. What was she thinking about? Oh yeah, she was about to puke. Okyagenstopa broken bar. Lance managed to get out before Hoplite could receive a faceful of bile. He slowed his spinning, blinking before promptly falling back to the dirt once again. He hadn't let go of Lance first, unfortunately, so she went with him. He managed to slow their mutual fall by catching the ground behind him with one hand, holding Lance aloft for a brief instant with his other hand. When it was all said and done, Lance found herself practically straddling his chest plate, both laughing like children. As a human, Hoplite really was basically a child to her, a little baby person. Or a broken bar? Yeah, a baby person. How old ams ya? Lance asked, leaning over his face. Hoplite blew away the strands of her hair from his face as he thought. Lance suspected that he was at least in his 30s. A broken bar? Yes. Much younger than her at 237. 238. Hoplite told her with a nod. Lance stared in shock at Hoplite. A broken bar? Wooh! Lance whined as she slapped his chest plate. Lance giggled as Hoplite downed another pitcher of wine, the man's head swaying to and fro as he set the container back down with a gasp. The man had practically drowned himself with how long he had been chugging a broken bar. Thankfully Hoplite had the gigantic lungs necessary for such a feat. The rout table before them was strewn with all manner of emptied plates, with some piles of them stacked as high as Lance was tall. An impromptu eating contest had taken place between Hoplite and 10 elf men, with Hoplite coming out as the victor. Lance in her drunken haze had taken note that Hoplite's cheeks had filled in quite a bit after the massive meal. He certainly hadn't been emaciated, his cheeks had not appeared all too hollow before the eating had begun. A broken bar. But now they were completely filled out, even bordering on the definition of chubby. It was hard to see, of course. Hoplite's face was all hard planes and sharp angles, even with the added fat. How had he put on weight so quickly? There had been hardly any time for Hoplite to properly digest the food he'd eaten. Then again, something similar happened after he had defeated the Pillarborn. His cheeks had looked deathly hollow than a broken bar up until he devoured that rabbit. An unpleasant memory, one she'd like to forget. Lance forcefully turned her thoughts from that, instead focusing on Hoplite's bright smile. Bloody and stuck with torn grey fur, the sound of crunching bones still echoing in her ears. She shook her head and took a deep, shaking breath. Lance thought that she had gotten over it after she had allowed Hoplite to spin her about, but there were still echoes of fear deep within her. It seemed there was a solution for this, however. She took a long swig of Ahkoolis whiskey, not bothering to pour it out of the large bottle it came in and instead opting to simply down it straight out of the container. Lance heard several nearby elves chastising her for such a disgusting act. Well, none of them had made a peep while watching Hoplite drink straight out of the pitchers, so Lance couldn't bring herself to care. The night's drinking had also helped Lance shed regard for her fellow elf. It wasn't her fault that they didn't get their spit on the bottle first. Ahkoolis whiskey was a powerful form of drink, often enough to put down smaller elves than she with just a single sip. Perhaps chugging half of it in one go wasn't the wise decision. She couldn't. BFFT, she was a goddess of drink. Nothing could stop her from not caring. Wash had she been doing? Oh by air, Hoplite. Lance shouted mightily. Yahash to thradis wishk, it'll pot hair on your ad. He lazily turned his head toward her, his eyes on the brink of shutting, perhaps for the next decade with how puffy his eyes had become. Those tired heavy eyes spotted the bottle, and Hoplite merely gestured for it with a lazy hand. Lance didn't hesitate as she approached her large body, proffering the bottle to Hoplite with an encouraging smile. Hoplite then took the bottle and knocked it back in a single long chug. The surrounding elves gasped in horror as their eyes finally found the label of the bottle. Lance, in a moment of clarity, thought about how awful her hangover was going to be if she didn't drink any water. In fact, it might be a good idea to hold off drinking any more tonight. The whiskey she had downed was enough to put down an orc twice her size, but that didn't mean it wouldn't give her a brain-splitting headache later. Since she wouldn't have to sleep tonight, she would just prioritize drinking water throughout the rest of the festivities. Thank the pillars she had the strongest liver on Ahkoolis, otherwise, all this drinking might have killed her. Lance knew other elves wouldn't have been able to drink half as much as she had tonight. Not even Muro had been able to beat her in a drinking contest, no matter how hard he had tried. Muro had been proud that he had crafted Lance to be one of the best watchers in the Fjord, but he had been somewhat spiteful that Lance was capable of outdrinking him. So they would get together to drink twice a year for about 100 years. Out of every single one of those contests, Muro had not won a single time. The last contest Lance and Muro had before his final rest ended hilariously. When Muro was at his drunkest, Lance had convinced him that it would be a fantastic idea to twin braid his hair. She had told him about the advantages of such a hairstyle, such as how it would collect his hair into two shorter lengths, rather than one long one. The other advantages she told him were just a broken bar. Well, she couldn't quite remember. Lance had been quite drunk, of course. The end result was Muro with his hair in childish pigtails, both girlishly hanging down the sides of his head. Lance had gone out of her way to find a pair of colorful pink ribbons, tying them into Muro's black hair. Muro, in his newfound confidence, apparently believed that he would be able to finally win the Hark Mother's hand in marriage with his luscious pigtails. He was then ordered by the Hark Mother to keep that hairstyle for an entire day, which Muro had done without a complaint. Lance knew that inside though, Muro was absolutely seething. Any elf that looked into his eyes could have seen that emotion burning like hot coals. It was absolutely hilarious, to her anyway. Muro had ordered her to never convince him to do anything while drunk again. That would be a good story to share actually. Her palate. Lance shouted right in the man's face. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked, placing both hands on his shoulder plates to keep from falling down face first into the dirt at his feet. He merely grunted in affirmation, those tired golden eyes barely maintaining eye contact with her. Being up close like this, she was more easily able to read what lay behind Hoplite's gaze. The drunken haze had made it somewhat difficult for her to focus in on his eyes, but now that they were basically nose-to-nose broken bar, she could see that he was happy. Anyway, frogs are quite fascinating. The yellow barrel-chested frog known as zists are capable of emitting a glowing light from their eyes. Lena told Michael as she looked inside of his open mouth. Standard human teeth are broken bar, she whispered to herself before continuing. It is unknown if the zist emits this glow to ward off predators or to attract mates, but I have found that this glow can be triggered if a zist is presented with alcohol. Michael replied, shifting his tongue away from Lena's finger. Have you had 3 sets of teeth in your lifetime so far, or are you still growing out of your adolescent teeth? Lena asked, withdrawing her finger from Michael's mouth. His adolescent teeth? 3 sets in his lifetime? He wiped off his lips and spit into a nearby wine glass before replying, humans got 2 sets of teeth in their lives. Strange. Lena whispered to herself, her voice nearly inaudible over the drunken bustle of the party surrounding them. They had opted to retreat to the edge of the party, right at the end of one of the tables near the route wall. Michael had decided that it likely wasn't going to be an issue to let the elf girls play nurse on him. He wasn't comfortable with giving them his blood though. Not that he was afraid of a little nick or anything, a broken bar. Besides, they said that just some spit and nails would be adequate. The procedure was only somewhat invasive, nothing intense, as they were still surrounded by a crowd of elves. Humans on Ahkoolis have 3 sets in their lifetime. Baby teeth, a set for adolescence, and the final set for adulthood. Lena's sister, Linny, told him as she not so discreetly grabbed the wine glass Michael had spit in before putting it in a small sack. She looked almost exactly like her sister, to the point where Michael really was considering if the two were really twins after all. Michael and Lena had thankfully managed to find Linny before she could locate Hoplite, a blessing considering how 37 may have reacted to Linny's request. "That's friggin' weird," Michael said with a shake of his head. He could hardly imagine what it would be like to have had 3 sets of teeth throughout his life. A broken bar, probably not that weird really, just a second set of baby teeth, right? He shook his head again, his skull feeling heavy as it swung to and fro. The drinking had been good, a broken bar real good. He hadn't been this trashed since before Earth fell. Since he last saw his friends and comrades. He took a deep breath to steady his nerves. If he began crying now, he would not stop until he was sober again, which wouldn't be for a long time. Michael wanted to enjoy his drunkenness. He would not turn his current euphoria into a sobfist, especially not in front of the ladies. "From our perspective, it's strange that you only have 2 sets," Linny said as she pulled out a pair of tweezers from a knapsack. "May I take a hair sample?" "Yeah, sure," Michael said, lifting his head to look at Lena. "So how much longer is this gonna take?" Lena smirked. "Not too much longer. Thank you again for allowing this examination, Michaela. Broken bar, especially considering how informal a request this was." Linny nodded along with her sister's words as she plucked a stray hair from Michael's beard, wincing as the hair was yanked free from his face. They could have just asked him to take off his helmet. A broken bar, getting his beard hair yanked wasn't pleasant. After Linny pocketed the strand of Michael's beard, he stood, looming over both Linny and Lena. His eyes had been getting heavier and heavier for hours now. A broken bar. Michael was on the verge of passing out. He realized. So much for being able to party all night. He hadn't even really done all that much partying, just eating and drinking. Michael supposed that the act of simply eating and drinking at a party could be considered a partying, but it still felt like Michael had done nothing. Well, except get a quick exam from some elf neckheads. Maybe he could just crash for an hour or so. "Can we finish up? I need to take a quick nap," Michael yawned, rubbing at his eyes with the palm of his gauntlet. Lena then placed a hand on Michael's chest plate. A broken bar, and she gave Michael a strange broken bar hungry look. Michael blinked before looking back to Linny, the other girl shaking her head and rolling those purple eyes of hers. "I've gotten all the samples I need, please, enjoy the rest of your night," Linny said with an annoyed huff, promptly turning away from the two of them to be reabsorbed into the shifting mass of elves. Michael then turned back to Lena, a small frown on his face. "What's going on?" Michael asked, attempting to hide the concern in his tone. Based on Lena's laugh, it was a pitiful attempt. "There is a broken bar. One more thing to do, Michael. If you're willing to come with me, we can begin the broken bar endurance test," Lena continued, putting emphasis on the word endurance. "You are quite a specimen. I think we will both enjoy the procedure," she said, that smirk deepening. "Whoa." Michael blinked in surprise, completely caught off guard and unable to properly react when Lena grabbed his hand. "What do you say?" Lena asked as she leaned into him. He stuttered like an idiot. He just said it was. Michael wasn't used to being the one who was propositioned, and he certainly hadn't been expecting it from Lena, unless maybe she was playing a prank on him of some kind. Yeah, that had to be it. She would lead Michael away with sweet words before making him jog around the root wall as an endurance test. That had to be it. Michael grinned, deciding to play along with the joke. He'd have her jog along with him when it came time, and if Lena didn't, he'd just go and pass out like he had planned. Show her to treat him like some kind of Marona broken bar. Well, to be fair, he wasn't the sharpest crayon in the tool shed, but he was still capable of rational thought. A broken bar while sober anyhow. "Sure thing, always glad to show how fit I am," Michael said confidently. Lena's grin deepened, and she began leading him away from the party. A broken bar and out of the root bowl. Hoplite's eyes slowly opened, his lid struggling to open through a fine layer of what felt like cement. He let out a groan, sitting up slowly from his position atop a rough-gnarled wooden floor. He shook his head, thankful that it wasn't pounding from last night's drinking. A broken bar. Wait, a broken bar? Drinking? Hoplite's face burned as if he'd just been blasted with plasma. the heat searing his flesh as he remembered how he had humiliated himself by gallivanting around as if he were some kind of civilian. He fought the urge to cover his face in his hands, as such a display would only serve to embarrass him further. A broken bar. "Ah, finally awake," he heard Lance's voice say. "Got to say, friend, you're more of a party animal than I thought you'd be, once the drink got in you." Hoplite looked up to see Lance, sitting before the open mouth of what seemed to be a cavern made entirely out of gnarled wood. The sun bled through the opening, illuminating the interior to reveal Lance sitting atop a blanket, her sandals laying strewn next to her. She sat with her legs crossed, looking back at him whilst bracing her hands against the ground. A clear bottle of blood-red wine sat next to her, gleaming in the sunlight. The mouth of the wooden cave beheld a view over a field of green grass far beneath it. "I cannot believe I allowed myself to." Hoplite began before abruptly shutting his mouth, drawing his lips to a fine line. Lance lifted a dark eyebrow. "Get drunk?" Hoplite said nothing in response, but Lance still continued. "I didn't think that the piece would affect you in such a way. Had to be one of the most interesting nights of my life, I think." She turned toward him fully, kneeling atop the blanket and grabbing the bottle of wine with a smile. "I didn't think it was possible for any man, no matter his size, to be able to drink more than me." "Good contest, but you won't beat me next time." Hoplite turned his head from her, slowly so as to not seem in any way flustered. The mere thought of his humiliating behavior last night, what he could remember of it anyway, was enough to nearly sear his flesh right off his bones. He would not let Lance see his eyes to know the embarrassment there. Thankfully he hadn't taken off his armor last night. Who knows what could have happened if it hadn't been a broken bar, but he had removed his helmet. His eyes went wide when he felt at his waist for his helmet, only to realize that it was missing. Hoplite stood like a boulder rising from the earth before promptly turning around to stare at the second mouth of the cavern. It was a tunnel of gnarled wood, dark and leading to who knew where. With his vision, he was able to see much further in the darkness than a normal human would have, even without his helmet, but he had no idea where the exit to this strange place was. Best to just jump out of the cavern's mouth and calm down, Lance told him firmly. "I have it right here," she told him as Hoplite's eyes fell upon her. "You said I could have a look at it while you slept. Had a feeling you would be a bit upset about it not being on your person, once you woke up." As she stood, Hoplite could see his helmet, sitting right in front of where Lance had been laying. The black metal gleamed in the morning sunlight, and he held back a sigh of relief. He quickly approached it, moving around Lance to lift it from the blanket and slip it over his head. The familiar weight of the helmet served to comfort him, both for the broken bar rightness of it, and the thought that none would be able to see the red staining his cheeks. He turned to Lance. "The activities of last night are to be kept confidential from Private Michael until further notice. Is that understood?" Lance lifted a couple of fingers to her lips and giggled. "Don't worry. He won't be hearing about what happened from me. The other elves though?" she said with a shrug. "Can't say for Thema broken bar, but I heard Michael left the party early with an elf girl, so he may not have heard anything yet." Hoplite's skin went cold. "Where is their location?" Hoplite asked urgently. "We have to find him. He could be in danger." Lance placed a hand gently on his arm and smiled. "He's fine, trust me. He's in this route somewhere, no doubt. We just have to head downward, since this is practically the top of the cluster," she said, pointing to the dark exit behind him. "How do you know that this is where he ended up?" Hoplite asked. "He could be anywhere in the bastion by now. The death day technically doesn't end until day breaks, but some elves do tire of the celebrations and gather in the nearest route cluster to rest. This is the closest one to Muro's party, so if Michael did come to rest, it'd be here," she told him, kneeling down to begin strapping on her sandals. "We'll leave the wine. I don't feel like drinking anymore after last night." "Unless you want to." "Negative. Let's move out," Hoplite said, sparing a look for the bottle before turning away. For the briefest of instants, Hoplite had seriously considered taking the bottle with him, a broken bar, a temptation that sent a chill of fear up his spine. He was a broken bar he was beginning to want. "A thing does not want," Commander's voice screamed in his ear, nearly causing Hoplite to jump. A broken bar. How had he gotten on Ahkoolis? How did he know that Hoplite wanted more drink? Either way, if Commander had found Hoplite, that was a good thing. He had disappeared along with Lord Jin, meaning that Terna would soon rise back to its feet as its master had returned. Hope filled Hoplite as he examined the surrounding cave via broken bar. But Commander wasn't there. It was just Hoplite and Lance, no one else. Another cold spike in his spine near broken bar. What was happening to him? Hoplite had never before suffered from auditory hallucinations. A broken bar. Did one of the implants in his brain short circuit? Was it one of the co-processors, a part of the synaptic accelerator? There was no way to tell until he could see a professional. For now, he'd need to keep this in mind in case it happened again. Lance shook her head with a small smile, standing after putting on her sandals. Hoplite then promptly turned, and began into the tunnel, Lance quickly following after him despite her poor footwear. The winding tunnels of blackness made Hoplite truly wonder if Michael would ever set foot within this place. After all, with how he had been reacting to the dark, this would have been the last place Hoplite would have expected the Marine to go. A broken bar unless he had a light source, which Michael indeed would have. Hoplite knew for a fact that the Marine had taken one from Hoplite's escape pod before they had come to this party. Hopefully, Michael will have left the flashlight on. That would make locating him significantly easier. Still, no matter how far they delved, no light could be seen from anywhere within the tunnels. It wasn't till they reached the bottom of the cluster that they finally found him, a broken bar sitting right at the mouth of a root cavern. Michael was splayed out on his back, his feet just barely sticking out of the mouth of the cave. Hoplite quickly activated his thermals. Seeing that Michael was indeed alive via broken bar, he rushed over to the Marine's side, his quick footsteps seeming to shake the whole root cluster. Lance struggled to keep up with Hoplite, her sandals slowing her considerably before she finally caught up with him. Michael's face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and his eyelids dark and puffy. Had he been exposed to some kind of chemical weapon? Damn Hoplite's dulled senses for not forcing Michael to wear his mask. Or a broken bar, or was the Marine just sleep deprived? Hoplite leaned in closer, Michael's blue eyes finding him and grinning. Hey sir, a broken bar. Sorry, I got busy last night. You are broken bar all night really? She didn't let me sleep, Michael whispered. She scratched up my back pretty good too. He gave a rasping chuckle. You got any water? Hoplite shook his head. Not on me, a broken bar who didn't let you sleep. Were you held prisoner? Did this girl torture you? Lance just sighed. I wouldn't say torture. Look at that stupid smile on his face, Lance pointed out. Indeed, Michael was smiling. That had to be the best worst night of my life. Here, broken bar. Or worst best night? I wanted to sleep, but oh man, a broken bar. Hoplite's brows knit in confusion. What are you talking about? Until now, Private. Michael's breath caught for a moment, cold fear replacing his tired expression. Lance looked up at him with an eyebrow raised. I think he got snagged by our broken bar. She hesitated. A human lover. Michael groaned as he lifted a hand towards Hoplite, who took it gently. Hoplite then easily hefted Michael to his feet, the Marine's eyes widening a moment before he let out a loud belch. Hoplite's brows remained knit. A human lover? You remember those girls that kept latching onto you last night, Hops? Lance asked as she stood. Affirmative. Very unprofessional behavior, Hoplite said, recalling the multiple incidents where an elf woman would clasp onto him in a very broken bar inappropriate manner, whispering to Hoplite about the things they could do to him should he follow them back to their homes. Thankfully Lance had battered them off of Hoplite in a drunken fury, for he had no mind at the time to do it himself. Michael took a deep shuddering breath, teeth clenched as he looked back into the root cavern. Was the Marine considering fleeing? What for? Well, I'm guessing one of them got to Michael, Lance said with a shrug. Hoplite stared, first at Lance, then at Michael, who was now visibly shaking, his eyes averted from Hoplite. Hoplite continued to stare for a long while before saying, Private, when we link back up with our forces, a broken bar. He paused. You will need to submit yourself for a medical examination. Michael blinked in surprise, looking back up to Hoplite in apparent confusion. That's it? He asked slowly, rubbing at his eyes. Kinda thought you'd say re-indoctrination, a broken bar or worse. Hoplite shook his head negative. The incident will go unreported. Michael's eyes widened further, his jaw working but failing to produce words. Hoplite was confused as to why he wasn't a broken bar furious. Michael had just a broken bar. What was the proper term? Mated? Yes, mated with a foreign species, and while mostly human in appearance, an elf was still a different species. For what Michael had done, a broken bar re-indoctrination would have been the least harsh punishment he could receive. But Hoplite didn't want to do that to Michael. That was a broken bar, that was the only reason. Hoplite nearly gasped in surprise at himself. What was happening? Where was his cold edge? He was really considering hiding what Michael had done from the Eighth Arm, a serious crime in and of itself. It was his duty to report Michael's crime, yes. But at the same time, Hoplite could hardly bring himself to think about turning Michael in. Hoplite wanted to cover for Michael's crime, but again a broken bar. Why? He pondered the question for a long while before an answer invaded his mind, like a parasite that had wormed its way into his flesh by force. Terna had fallen. What was the point? Hoplite's skin again froze over, golden eyes widening and breath stilling. Lance and Michael had returned to bantering with one another, not realizing that Hoplite had gone still as a statue, a broken bar, though perhaps they were used to that. Terna had fallen, Terna had fallen, Terna had fallen. The words repeated themselves in his mind again and again, as if they had been drilled into his skull by the chair. There was truly no point in reporting Michael, even if they linked back up with the crew of the Sparrow. What was the point? What would Captain Stleven do? There could only be a handful of survivors from the Sparrow on a way a broken bar. They couldn't afford to punish Michael. There was also the fact that Hoplite himself had committed a crime last night by getting intoxicated. Hoplites were not allowed to partake in such things, and doing so was grounds for indoctrination. Wouldn't it be hypocritical of him to report Michael when Hoplite had no intention of revealing what he himself had done last night? He shut his eyes, and finally took a breath. A flurry of emotion raged within him, frustration, fear, and confusion all shifting in a chaotic dance as he tried to decide on a course of action. He should report Michael and himself for intoxication and debauchery. Who would carry out the punishment? Terna had fallen. Captain Stl would find some way to punish them appropriately. If he was even alive, and if Hoplite could even find him. If Stl was indeed alive, who was to say the captain would even care about the crime? Terna had fallen. Stl wouldn't just forego the law because Terna was going through a rough patch. Rough patch? The homeworld has been taken, along with all the inner colonies. The underdeveloped outer colonies were all that was left of Terna, and without contact with the core of the octopus, they'd eventually become lost, forming their own governments. As all lost colonies eventually did. Terna is fallen. Sir? Michael asked, his tone somewhat shaky. Are you all right? We need to retrieve the equipment you dropped last night, Private. Hoplite said, relief filling him as he remembered the lost ballistic mask. The immediate task that needed doing helped to stave off the horrid thoughts that assailed him. A broken bar. He would think more about what should be done about Michael and himself later, but for now, they would simply focus on retrieving the mask from the root bowl. Then, it would be back to the Fiend Wall, no more delays. Jiravel, Lena said as she approached him, I managed to get some of the blood, a broken bar, just a small bit, beneath my fingernails, along with a fair few other samples just in case. Jiravel looked up from his desk to stare at her, a dark eyebrow lifted quizzically. Jiravel was Lena's teacher in biology, and his doka was able to see the twisting ladders of the blood. Lena found it so interesting that such tiny organisms made up everyone's being. If only she could see them for herself. Oh, there were diagrams that Jiravel had drawn, of course, but Lena still craved to see what her mentor could. Blood from Hoplite. Why did you scratch him? He asked her. I'm surprised he didn't kill you for it. Lena's face grew red and she shook her head. Not Hoplite, another Outworlder man who accompanied him. She told him I'd rather not reveal how I got my samples. Now, if you would just see the ladders of his blood. I wanted Hoplite's blood specifically, Lena. Jiravel said gently, but a sample from another Outworlder is of interest nonetheless. Hold up your fingers, please. Lena obliged him, lifting her reddened nails for Jiravel to inspect. Those bright green eyes of his stared for a long while before he finally settled back in his seat, a hand on his chin. Concerned eyes found Lena's, and she could see the confusion in them. Hoplite certainly is an outworlder, Jiravel said. I did not lie to the Ahkoolis when I claimed that a broken bar, but there is a trace of something native to Ahkoolis in his blood. Not his human genetics, certainly, but the blood of Zod flows within him as it does all life on Ahkoolis. Lena's eyes widened a fraction at this discovery. The implications of this knowledge were mostly unknown to her, but Lena did realize its importance. Do you think he could be able to draw on Foundation? She asked him, genuinely curious as to his answer. Just a small trace could make it so, but that is not my main focus, Jiravel told her, weaving his fingers together as he rested his elbows on his desk. There was another trace of something in Hoplite's blood that I saw that day, also native to our world. I had hoped that I had merely imagined it a broken bar. Lena kept silent, the next words Jiravel uttering sending her into a panicked gasp. I've seen this type of blood only once before, but I could never forget it. I believe Hoplite's blood is a broken bar draconic, Jiravel told her with a slight shudder. Lena shook her head, wobbling on her feet as she stammered, a child of the P-Pillars Unbound? No, the trace is too faint for that. I will need to find Turlin, wherever he has disappeared to, and access his library. I must do more research, Jiravel said, determination replacing the fear in his gaze. Pillars save them a broken bar. If Lena understood what Jiravel proposed, a broken bar, then Hoplite was a broken bar. Hoplite was the child of a dragon. Twindle sighed as she settled into her bedroll, her eyes finding the ceiling of her tent. The light was now beginning to bleed through the cloth, the coolness of the morning held back by the thick grey canvas surrounding her. Her armor lay strewn haphazardly beside her bedroll, the heavy plate armor having proved too uncomfortable to sleep in. Not that it would have mattered, Twindle hadn't slept last night. In fact, she hadn't slept for well over a week now. The dark circles under her eyes attested to that. Thankfully her elven blood reduced her need to sleep, but her human blood demanded more rest than what she had been able to achieve. Normally, it would be easy for her to find sleep, but lately, it has been eluding her grasp. A broken bar. Because every night she was terrified. Twindle was terrified of her own lineage. When would the madness begin to set in, she wondered. Was this sudden insomnia just from her personal fears, or was it the beginning of her descent into insanity? She felt tears welling in the corners of her eyes. The knowledge that the madness was a certainty, rather than a possibility, drove her into a pit of despair deeper than even the IRSC. Twindle's eyes then shifted to her blade, safe in its leather scabbard beside her bedroll. It was a finely crafted thing, almost as tall as she was and with a keen edge that could split steel. If it came to it, a broken bar, would she be able to fall on her sword to prevent inflicting tragedy? Would Twindle's goddess Athena come to despise her for denying fate? Perhaps so. Broken bar, but it would be best not to dwell on the blade, not when it came to that potential use. She turned from it with another sigh. It was time to rise from her bedroll and begin the day. Hoplite, Lance, and that boy she healed would be returning to the Fiend Wall soon, likely today if she guessed right. Twindle needed to climb out of the pit of misery she currently wallowed in. Her friends needed her to at least appear stable. More for them, rather than herself. Twindle had promised them that she could find a way, that she would be able to save them a broken bar. Yet the more she thought about how to stop the inevitable, the more impossible a task it seemed. She sat up from her bedroll finally, rubbing at irritated eyes. They were seriously bloodshot, she was certain. Twindle struggled to bring herself to her feet, her bedroll insisting that she come back to its warm embrace. She struggled out of it after a brief spar, pulling free of its smothering warmth to ready herself for the day. First, she donned her armor, a long process considering the lack of help. Twindle did not mind it though, and she'd rather not trouble anyone to help her with such a minor thing as donning her plate. When she finally finished, Twindle grabbed the hilt of her scabbarded greatsword and left her tent. The morning light was dull and sickly today, a small bundle of thick clouds shielding it from view. The night's coolness had yet to leave completely in the small hours of first light, and Twindle relished in the coolness, knowing that the summer's heat would beat down upon her later. The fiends on the opposite end of the breach had been mostly taken care of, with only a few stragglers here and there amongst the rubble. New fiends were still coming, however, droves still crossing the great bridge connecting the Fewwood to the Fiendwood. As such, Twindle had opted to retreat to the safer end of the wall to rest. While waiting for Hoplite, she and her friends had been staying in the forward camp, ready to lash out at any encroaching fiends should they try and attack the workers clearing the rubble. It was nice opening her tent to see fresh green grass and normal, living people as opposed to the dead and putrid purple landscape of the Fiendwood. It was still so strange to see just how short the divide was between the thriving Fewwood and the corrupted Fiendwood. Just right across this thin section of wall a broken bar, thank goodness for Drow's pustule, else the Fiendwood's sick curse would surely taint the rest of Ahkoolis. Perhaps if they slayed Cousin, the curse would subside? Twindle did not know for certain, but either way, Cousin had to perish. The soul of her caretaker had to be reclaimed, and she would wrest it free of Cousin's silvery hands if she had to chop them off. Twindle's tired expression must have changed to something akin to that of a wrathful lioness, for the Fiendwallers in their simple brown and grey garb all averted their gazes from hers, some moving to clear a path even if they were a dozen paces away. Twindle cursed herself for allowing rage into her heart. A broken bar, tranquility and wrath were to not share a place in her, yet the mere thought of what Cousin had done. No, best not to dwell on that now. She made her way through the camp, towards the mess tent, replacing her wrathful gaze with something more passive. Thankfully the Fiendwallers stopped jumping at her presence. The last thing she wanted was for the people to fear her. She was a disciple of Athena, not Ahkoolis, and she had to conduct herself as such. By time she found the large tent, she felt exhausted. Twindle had already picked up whispers about her supposedly a bad mood and how it would be best to stay clear. How had word spread so quickly? These Fiendwallers spoke only in gossip it seemed, and had become proficient in spreading it like a plague. By the end of the day, they would likely be claiming that she had beheaded a man for looking at her funny. As if a champion of tranquility would ever conduct herself in such a manner. Twindle ignored the stares as she passed into the mess tent, spying Theopolis off to her left, inhaling a fist-sized chunk of ham and swallowing it without chewing. How the old elf managed to eat like that without choking was still a mystery to her, but it was one that she was all right with not knowing. The mess tent grew quiet for a brief moment, a dozen Fiendwallers staring with some apprehension from their tables before averting their gazes. Twindle then began to hear plenty of talk about how pleasant the weather was today. She sighed, shaking her head and turning her attention back to Theopolis. Theopolis sat on the floor, next to a fully occupied table. Most of the tables in the tent were small and circular, more like something one would see outside of an Akhindari tea house. Those who occupied the table adjacent to Theopolis were her companions, all staring at Twindle as if she had ripped the head off a chicken with her bare hands. What was she supposed to have done? Use the blade of her sword? True, she could have simply requested a knife to use, but it had always been easiest for Twindle to dehead a chicken with her bare hands. Now no one in the camp would even let her near an animal broken bar again. She shook her head, putting on a calm smile as she approached the table. Elam stared with knitted brows, his red flesh somewhat pale in the dim morning light that seeped through the open tent flaps. "You are broken bar, you all right?" he asked her, scratching at one of his black horns. "Heard you beat someone up?" Alistair laughed, putting a gauntleted hand on his forehead. "I heard you killed someone, and that afterward you claimed to be the daughter of the lost child," he finished, adjusting his bloody red headband beneath his blonde hair. Nolvi simply rolled her eyes, and began staring at her empty plate. Like always, those blue and green eyes stared with an intensity that bespoke of deep thinking. A broken bar, or she was daydreaming particularly hard. A long leather skirt covered her down to her ankles, along with a matching cape about her shoulders, along with a blue blouse that clashed with the browns of her skirt and cape. Well, it was no business of Twindle's what Nolvi chose to wear, but that was hardly the kind of attire she should be wearing for a trek into the Fiendwood. Not that Elam bore much more sense than her, insisting on going about shirtless that way. What was wrong with cladding oneself in good steel? Alistair at least seemed to have the good sense to wear armor, but he had painted it a lustrous shade of gold for whatever reason. Again, not her business, but it made him stick out like a Gorshak in a mudlip. Theopilou's clothing would be a good for the fiend, would the all-black watcher's uniform perfect for nighttime scouting. Not that the old elf wanted any part of that. Unlike Twindle and company, Theopoilou only wanted to act as a guide. The old elf had apparently been there before Curzon's curse had ravaged it. If it was true, and Theopoilou didn't seem the kind to lie, then he was the oldest elf she had personally ever met. Twindle blinked when she realized that there was one face missing from the tably broken bar. "Where is Kidka?" Twindle asked. "Is he fighting with the other tongues, or has he gone to the other side of the wall to face whatever fiends remain?" "Former," Elam replied with a sigh. "The tongues got bored and they're holding some kind of contest near the breach." Twindle shook her head. Kidka was always engaging in roughhousing despite his social awkwardness. You'd not expect it from the man, but he was actually quite competitive. Twindle would need to go and retrieve him whenever Hoplite arrived today. She took a seat at the table and sighed. "I did not beat up or kill anyone. I was just in a foul mood and wore it openly," Twindle told them, gesturing for a plate of food from one of the passing serving girls. She brought it to Twindle with a nervous smile before setting it on the table before her, quickly giving a short bow before scampering off. Again, how was it that fiendwallers were so talented in spreading gossip? Gali needed a firmer hand on this sort of behavior. Perhaps he should be taught the ways of tranquility, should Twindle ever get the time to read him the texts. She sighed again, grabbing a piece of bread from the plate and shoving the whole thing in her mouth, uncaring that she all but mimicked Theopilou's manner of eating. She was simply too hungry to care. Alistair leaned toward Twindle, lowering his voice to a small whisper. "Did you hear word yet about what Hoplite did?" Twindle paused her chewing for an instant before nodding. Indeed, she had. "Do you think it's true?" "You think he actually killed Tuji?" Alistair whispered, his brows knit. "Be careful about using his name." Twindle whispered back quickly, "We don't want anyone believing that we knew him, especially Hoplite. That might open us up to questions we would have difficulty answering." "I had wondered why he didn't appear in the dream." A broken bar, Nolvi whispered, fingering a blank spot on the table idly, "but I didn't think it was because he died. Tuji had it coming if you ask me," Elam said, "chasing us around the Feellands that way. At least now we don't have to deal with him ourselves." Twindle sighed and shook her head. "He was a shamani. It is not their way to kill someone without challenging them to Toma first." "If we would have refused a broken bar," she continued, lowering her voice further until it was nearly inaudible, "Tuji wouldn't have been able to do anything to us." Alistair shook his head. "You know that isn't how this works." Alistair told her flatly, "We wouldn't have been able to say number." Nolvi nodded along to Alistair's words before saying, "We likely could have slain him with how we are now." But before a broken bar, she trailed off before staring at a particularly interesting cup. They were powerful, yes, but Tuji had still been far beyond them. Nolvi might have been confident that Tuji could have been slain, but some of the party would have surely died, and Twindle would not allow that if she could help it. She placed a hand on her temple as she thought back to her and Tuji's long talks. In the dream, she had tried to convince Tuji that there was a better option to their situation than conflict, but the foolish man had refused to listen to her. Tuji's entire existence was for the fight and only the fight. The fact that he was participating in the ultimate competition had only stoked his fiery passion for battle. But Twindle had still treed a broken bar. There had been a spark of something behind Tuji's eyes that Twindle had seen, her half-elven blood allowing her the ability to read emotion. It wasn't much due to her diluted lineage, but it was still enough to see that Tuji had been homesick. Not that his home would have been short of any battles, of course. Shimano was a land rife with war, the soil dyed crimson with generations of blood. Twindle had thought that maybe, just maybe, if she could have convinced Tuji that she could have helped him a broken bar. Well, there was no use in crying over spilled blood. What was done, was done. All Twindle could do now was move on and save whoever she could. "You okay?" Alistair asked softly, concern in his eyes. "It hasn't begun for you a broken bar, has it?" Twindle smiled. No, not yet. Hopefully not ever, should we find what we're looking for." "Curzon comes first," Alistair growled out through clenched teeth. then we can focus on ourselves. He must pay. Twindle nodded, leaning over the table to place a hand on his shoulder. Trust me, he will. We will make him pay, she told him with conviction. Before any more words could be spoken, a man burst into the mess tent, shouting something that stopped all motion, all sound. The hero of the fiend wall is returned. The man yelled ecstatically. Twindle immediately stood from her seat, her friends following suit as cheering broke out across the mess tent. Hoplite had quickly become a popular name around these parts, but that was hardly a surprise considering the army of fiends he had dismantled. Hoplite was a good man, a bit cold, but a good man. A bad person wouldn't have bravely risked death or worse to confront thousands of fiends alone. Twindle was glad to have Hoplite along for the journey. If only she could convince him to come with them to battle Kazuna Broken Bar. Maybe she could negotiate with him on that. Perhaps her group could aid Hoplite in finding his companions, provided he helped them face Kazun at the end of their journey. The prospect of fighting the Lord of Hate and Thief of Spiraling Death would have turned most men fleeing with soiled breeches. Hoplite, however, seemed made of sterner stuff. When the opportunity presented itself, she would ask him for help. A man that could slay a pillar born a broken bar, a terrifying thought, but one that also filled her with determination. Kazun didn't seem quite as intimidating as he did when he had first found her in a mant. The bastard had taunted and terrified her before finally stealing Jirag's soul in front of her. Jirag, who had raised her and taught her the art of smithing. Jirag with his big hands and bigger smiley broken bar just gone. Hate me, then come for me. Kazun's parting words seemed to echo in her ears. Hate me, you half-blooded whelp, grow strong and come for me. I will await you at Castle Blackgaze. She grit her teeth as she stormed out of the tent, her friends and everyone else in the mess tent at her heels. Oh, how Twindle did hate Kazuna Broken Bar. She would come for him. They all would. And they would cast him down to the pits of Ahkoolis. The creature is returned. You must kill him now. The voice echoed like an avalanche through Elam's mind, and he winced as the deep ringing tone continued to speak. Its blood is tainted with impurity. It cannot be allowed to exist. Once I reclaim my body, and I will reclaim it one day, Elam, with or without your help. Though you would be foolish to continue denying my deal. Elam took a deep breath and concentrated on his surroundings. The voice grew quiet usually when he was focused on other things. Yes, a broken bar. It was a cloudy day today. Perhaps it would rain and help cool his ever-warm flesh. Being an Ifrit, his bright red skin always felt feverish to the touch. It wasn't uncomfortable for him, of course. Broken bar, though the rain had always felt pleasant. People just didn't understand why he chose to go shirtless all the time. Did they not realize that an Ifrit would cook in those thick clothes humans normally wore? Elam could scarcely imagine wearing the plate armor that Twindle and Alistair both sported. Such armor would roast him like a turkey for sure. How could the other races handle being so cold that they could get away with wearing such garments? Elam could feel the voice beginning to brush his mind again, and he grit his teeth, turning his thoughts instead towards Hoplite. Elam needed to keep himself distracted long enough for the voice to recede. A broken bar and Hoplite's presence was certainly distracting enough. Just the fact that he was an outworlder was more than enough to draw Elam's thoughts away from the voice scratching at the back door of his mind. The Golem man stood before the mayor of the Fiend Wall and a crew of defenders, looming like the Elam tree over Gali and his soldiers. Elam and Twindle, as well as the rest of their party, stood just ahead of a crowd of Fiendwallers who had gathered to stare in awe at the outworlder. That tall elf girl, Lance, and the human Hoplite had taken from that fallen star stood just behind the towering metal man. The human, Elam could not remember his name, looked a bit uncomfortable being there. Was his name Mitchell? Mikkel. It was one of those for sure. Elam didn't blame Mikkel. If it had been him on the end of those murderous glares the Fiendwallers cast his way, Elam would be nervous too. The two were conversing not far from where Elam stood at the base of the now much smaller hill of rubble filling the breach in the Fiend Wall. The Fiendwallers had made much progress in clearing out the rubble, though Elam didn't quite know how they intended to rebuild the destroyed section. The Fiend Wall had been just a single piece of stone raised from the bones of Ahkoolis Bios himself, not constructed in segments. It would be a patchwork of jobs for sure. The voice began scratching again, And Elam answered by scrunching up his brow as he stared at the wall. He had to keep himself distracted, just a little bit longer, then the voice would recede. Elam's eyes found the cross-sections of rooms, now empty of their contents to function as makeshift battlements. Archers kept their eyes toward the fiendwood, most looking terribly bored by their now less eventful shifts. There were barely any fiends bothering the workers now. The tongues had made sure of that after Hoplite had left. Scratch. The fiend wall had been originally just a slab of solid stone. Elam had learned it had only been tunneled into by Gratian's criminal populace. Apparently, the king of Gratian had believed there to be vast wealth in gems and gold within the wall, and had poured into it with an army of criminals under the supervision of a warden and his defenders. Scratch. Once all the wealth had been extracted from the wall, the king had decided that the fiend wall would make a great extension to his kingdom. The elves of the Feywood hadn't approved of Gratian's mining operations on the wall, but as they were busy fending off the Ahkoolis at the time, they couldn't afford to send a strike force to bat away the Gratianers' greedy hands. Thus, Gratian was able to completely get away with hollowing out the wall. That was what Gali had told him anyway. Now the fiend wall was a penal colony with semi-independence from Gratian. It was seen as a punishment to be sent to live here. Knowing that the fiends would always be scratching at the wall, seeking to spread their curse made sleeping a burden most days. That was what he could gather from some of the locals anyhow. Some of them had been born in the wall, but even more were sent to live here. Stay focused on what I command you. Slay the creature standing before you now, unleash the silver flame, and immolate the outworlder in death. The voice managed to get out. Embrace the power I offer, and all here will be unable to harm you. Elam. Do not speak to me, Elam whispered under his breath. I deny you. Through me is the path to your salvation. To deny me, is to deny life. Without my gifts, you will go mad. I deny you, Elam hissed, gritting his teeth and clutching his graying arm with enough force to force the bright red flesh of his knuckles to go white. Nails were driven into his temples and he strained to keep himself from clutching at his skull from the pounding agony he felt. Elam struggled to keep from falling to the ground face first, something he certainly didn't want Twindle or any of the others to see. If Elam fell, he would begin screaming at the voice in his head. He just knew it. That would be a sight for everyone. If the party even suspected that he was beginning to go mad, a broken bar, but they wouldn't do that to him. A broken bar, would they? His friends could not. No, they would note a broken bar. The grey flesh on his right arm seemed to undulate, as if it were amused by Elam's defiance. Suffer then a broken bar, but I will always be here. I know that you will take my offer one day, Elam, and that day fast approaches. Your will is quickly decaying along with your mind. Soon you will no longer be able to hold on to who you are. When you finally burn in the sea of your anguish, when your soul is nothing more than a pile of ash, I will be there to scrape up what remains. And just like that, a broken bar, the voice receded. Elam took a deep shuddering breath, placing a hand to his brow right as Twindle put a hand on his shoulder. He dearly hoped that she and the others hadn't heard his words. How could Elam explain that his own arm was trying to bargain with him for his sanity? Already they knew that the growth was causing him intense pain in random bursts, but Elam hadn't told them that it was also beginning to talk to him now. Illuma broken bar? Twindle asked slowly. Are you well? I can channel to numb the pain if you need. Elam turned his head and flashed his best smile. I'm fine. It has already subsided. Twindle's brows knit together in a rictus of concern, a look that wasn't rare on the woman. Elam feared that the stress was going to get to Twindle eventually. A broken bar. She had always been so concerned for the well-being of others, especially those of her party. Really, she could really pass for a doting mother. Had her face borne any wrinkles or her hair any strands silver? Being half-elf meant that age would not touch her for a long time, not that any of them would live to reach old age. Of course, Twindle insisted that there had to be a way to save themselves from what was coming, but Elam could not see it. He turned his head away from Twindle, feeling his false smile beginning to slip. Elam did not want his friends to see that he wasn't doing well. After all, he was supposed to be the overconfident, mischievous devil of the group. A broken bar, if he dragged himself about like Nolvi did, that would bring down everyone's mood. Elam needed to be confident that there was another option for their survival. Otherwise, he may have to seek a broken bar other methods, to keep himself sane. He clutched his graying arm as a small temptation began to fill him. He didn't have to go mad or kill anyone. There was a way for him to survive. No, he would not do that. He could not cave to the canker melded to his arm. If Ilum did that, a broken bar, if he did that, there would be no coming back. Twindle's hand finally released his shoulder, and Ilum was thankful that she did, for while her hand had been a broken bar, Ilum could feel the canker almost stretching itself across his flesh, almost as if it were reaching for Twindle. He pondered just cutting his arm off completely. It wasn't the first time he had considered it, but if Ilum did that, then the creature's bargain too would be cut off. It was a hard thing to admit, but knowing that there was an option there to save himself from the madness of broken bar, it was almost like a comfort. "I think they're done talking," Kidka said from behind him, words eerily stable. "I'm not waiting any longer, cousin must be put down." And just like that, the man moved past everyone, Kidka's crimson cape flowing in a sudden gust of wind that had emerged from the gap in the wall. For a moment, it seemed as if the wind were grieving a broken bar or screaming. Ilum had a feeling that there would be plenty of both once they were through the wall. As Kidka went, so did all the rest, with Twindle marching right behind Kidka, urging patience. Ilum took a deep breath to steady himself as the rest of the party passed by him. Alistair was fixing Hoplite with an intense gaze, one Ilum couldn't quite get a read on. Was he going to ask Hoplite something, or was he going to demand the Outworlder's boots? Ilum couldn't quite tell. Nolvi trailed along just behind him, her eyes ever glued to the ground. Ilum wished that he could just live in Nolvi's world for 5 minutes. Surely that could be enough time to understand why she behaved that way. It was a miracle that the girl didn't just slam into every obstacle on her path. Theopalu, the only member of the party that was a broken bar unafflicted with their condition, chomped down on an entire loaf of bread as he passed, the wind blowing some crumbs from the elf's maw. That old piece of Nifiri jerky was the best chance they had to get through the Fiendwood to reach cousin. He had to be kept alive above anyone else, broken bar, even his friends, for without Theopalu, there was no way they could make it through the Fiendwood unscathed. Well, perhaps say unscathed was the wrong word, but without Theopalu it would be outright impossible. He just had to hold on to himself, at least until he could get his vengeance on cousin. Who knew? Maybe the gods would look favorably upon whoever slayed the Lord of Hatred of Broken Bar if they were to offer them a reward. Ilum knew what he would ask for. He put on his confident smirk as he stepped forward to meet Hoplite along with the others. Maybe there was a different way. Perhaps the Outworlders possessed something that would be able to stave off what was to come. Wishful thinking, true, but Ilum needed to keep his hopes high in the coming days. There would be more than enough time to ask Hoplite when they were all properly away from there. Fiendwalders. He'd need to word the questions carefully to conceal the truth behind them. After all, a broken bar. If Hoplite found out that Ilum and his friends were all pillar-born, who knew what he would do? Lance took a deep breath to steady her nerves as she stared into the all-devouring purple maw of the Fiendwood. The rotted landscape smelled a constant sickly sweet, the aroma so pungent that it made her nearly gag. The countless spirals that were etched into seemingly every surface made her stomach roil as well. The spiral was everywhere, on the rocks, the blackened trees, the soil, and even the very clouds in the sky. It seemed that everything past the fiend wall formed this vile ever-swirling pattern, a broken bar even across the countless corpses of fiends that Hoplite had left behind after his battle. They still wriggled and writhed violently, stacked together in a pile that was nearly as high as the hill of rubble that Lance now stood atop. Fiends could not truly die, not unless they were cast into fire. Thus the Fiendwalders had erected a series of small bonfires around the corpse pile, with heavily armored defenders constantly hacking the mangled still-moving bodies into the flames. Why they did not simply light the lot of them on fire at once, Lance did not know. Perhaps they were afraid it would draw Cousin's attention if they made too large a flame, or maybe they believed that such a massive fire would spread. Lance thought that it would be a splendid idea to let the Fiendwood be immolated. It would be a service to ignore fire safety in this instance. In fact, Lance may be more comfortable with walking through a burning hellscape, rather than this cursed atrocity to nature. Not for the first time, Lance found herself reconsidering her decision to accompany Hoplite on his quest. She had been craving adventure, been yearning for it beat a broken bar, but this was simply foolish. It was one thing to say that she'd go into the Fiendwood, but now that she was actually about to delve into Cousin's realm, a broken bar, well, her feet were getting cold. Funny that they had been warm during the ascent. She'd practically ran all the way up here. She had managed to get to the top of the rubble hill first, with Hoplite still straggling behind the rest of the party as he carefully sought a path up. The pile of debris was significantly smaller than it had been when they had first come to the Fiend Wall, but that didn't mean that it was any less treacherous to scale, especially for Hoplite. With how heavy he and that armor was, one wrong step could send him tumbling all the way back down, with a few more rocks to keep him company during the fall. The rest of the party fared a bit better, but not by much, save for Kidka and Theopoulou, of course. Those two had actually stayed just behind her during the ascent, but Lance had the feeling that they had been holding back, especially Kidka. Theopoulou's slow climb could have easily been attributed to his laziness. He'd never fully applied himself to his work, even as a watcher. That wasn't to say that the elder elf was bad at his job, quite the contrary. Not one watcher has been able to top Theopoulou's many records, a broken bar no one but Lance herself that was, after he first took his leave from the watch. If Theopoulou took things seriously, he would be the best watcher to have ever lived. Lance was sure of it. Kidka though, he seemed to be genuinely holding back. The pale man had been specifically avoiding eye contact with her, likely so Lance wouldn't be able to read his emotions. It was mildly aggravating, not the avoidance of eye contact, but the fact that he felt the need to hold back. What, did he think that he was going to offend her by pulling ahead? Or maybe he was just anxious because Lance was certain that he had received training from a watcher. After all, only someone that had been trained by a watcher would be able to spot one hiding amidst the many trees of the Fiendwood. No one could find a watcher but a watcher a broken bar. Well, most people could not anyway. Lance had learned that when she had first met Hoplite. He definitely could not have been trained by a watcher, due to his nature as an outworlder. Kidka, however, was not like Hoplite. He was a native to Ahkoolis, meaning that he had to have learned those techniques from someone. Kidka even fought like a watcher did, ducking and weaving just as gracefully as any elf she'd ever seen. If Lance ever found out who had given training to Kidka, they would have to be reported to the Ahkoolis. Humans knowing of watchers' secrets could only end badly. The only reason the Ahkoolis had been held off from conquering the Fiendwood was because of those very secrets. Lance would have taken Kidka to be questioned by Mura that very day, but she had not wanted to risk conflict with his friends. If they had resisted, it was entirely possible that Hoplite would have fought too, and the last thing she had wanted was a bloodbath. She'd have to pick Kidka's brain whenever the opportunity presented itself on their journey. A journey that she was delaying by standing here and staring. Lance realized she knew that she was doing it on purpose, looking for any reason to stay out of Cousin's realm, or at least to delay a broken bar. She turned away from Kidka and the others, refocusing on the Fiendwood below. Lance was here now. She had requested leave and had told Hoplite that she'd come with him for his journey. She had given her word, and there was no backing out of it now. Was this what an adventure felt like? Cold sweat at her brow, shaking hands, and insects fluttering about in her stomach. Yes, that had to be it. To be fair to herself, she was about to venture into a place no one had ever returned from, a broken bar where Cousin himself resided, the thief of spiraling death. She had a right to be fearful. With that thought, she finally began her descent, carefully picking her path down the hill of rubble toward the camp that had been set up on this side of the wall. It was a small thing compared to the tent city on the greener side, but it was still just as if not more busy. Tongues and defenders both took up a watch on the perimeter of the camp, waiting for any stray fiends to approach. Indeed, there were still fiends coming even now, in groups of 10 or 20, likely pouring across the great bridge that joined Fenner to the Fiendwood. The tongues and defenders made short work of the fiends that approached the camp, striking them down before dragging them to the nearest bonfire to be put to rest. Once she finally reached the bottom, she let out a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from her brow while trying to avoid looking at the ground at her feet. The countless spirals etched into the soil may send her scurrying right back up the debris and back into the fewwood. Again she found herself considering her next actions. Lance could just go home right now. There wasn't really anything Hoplite or the others could do to get her to stay, but again, she had told Hoplite and Michael that she would. If Lance went back now, her word would be devalued and Lance will have betrayed not only Hoplite, but herself. It was settled, a broken bar. She would go into the Fiendwood. Strangely, now that she was firm in her conviction to go through with this suicidal journey, she felt a tad less anxious. At least about herself. There was still a chance that Maris, that wonderful fool, would attempt to follow her beyond this point. She dearly hoped he wouldn't, but in truth even if he did, how would he get over this mound of rubble? It was hard for Hoplite to scale it. Imagining an entire tree doing so was ludicrous. She waited at the foot of the rubble hill for the others, still keeping her eyes well above the spiraling ground. Kidka reached her first, of course, followed by Theopoulou, the rest trailing right behind them. Hoplite was still picking his path down the debris when Michael finally reached the bottom, huffing and puffing as he approached her and the rest of the party. "Hard climb been something like that wearing all this armor," Michael said with a shrug. "Glad to be over on this side. Thought for Broken Bar didn't like the looks I got." Alistair nodded. "Yeah, you're not exactly what I would call a popular around here. Since you left for the Fewwood, all we've been hearing is revenge talk and how they hope that you get cursed or killed on our trip," Alistair said almost nonchalantly, causing Michael to wince. "I mean, that won't happen," Alistair said reassuringly. "I'm certain that most of us will be fine." "Most of us, huh?" Michael muttered. "Well, I know I'll be part of a most." "That's the spirit." Alistair laughed heartily. "Say, what is your name again?" "Was it Mikkel?" The men then continued to converse as Hoplite continued his descent, the two speaking more animatedly as time went on. Lance couldn't bring herself to keep track of their conversation, instead focusing on Hoplite's slow climb. It was quite a Broken Bar funny, in a way. The man was always pressed for time, saying that they needed to be quick about things and moving at what felt like a cheetah's pace in nearly all things he did. Yet now, he was carefully picking his path, briefly pausing here and there to consider before gently continuing his path down. She knew why he took his time, of course. If he tried to go as quickly as he could, Hoplite would no doubt dislodge several pieces of rubble, and the only direction they could go was down. They'd roll into camp and crush everything in their path, tents, people, whatever the boulders came into contact with. It was nice to see this considerate side from Hoplite now and then. A Broken Bar it popped out on occasion in the strangest ways. Like how Hoplite had gone out of his way to save her in the Ahkoolis. He hadn't needed to do that, but he did. Sure, Lance had technically failed her duty in vetting Hoplite for his humanity. A Broken Bar, but he had appeared as anything but human. He had merely said that he was a Hoplite, and Lance, in her foolishness, had assumed that he was some sort of golem. Hoplite himself had denied being a golem, but she had still thought that he was some kind of construct. That had been an egregious error in judgment on her part, and she nearly paid the price for it. Lance could not bring herself to blame Hoplite for this, of course. After all, he had been ignorant of their ways. It hadn't been done on purpose. If Hoplite hadn't bent the Ahkoolis rules, that would have been the end of her career, a Broken Bar, and a dishonorable one at that. Thankfully the Ahkmother had not disallowed the technicality presented to her and had acted on it. She was a good woman, and an even better leader. Lance hoped that she was doing well after Muro's passing. She hadn't run into her at his death day, but that had been when Lance was sober. The two could have crossed paths countless times that night. Lance briefly considered if Hoplite and the Ahkmother had crossed drunken paths during the celebration as he finally reached the bottom of the mound, marching forward with heavy steps. Lance, Michael, and the rest of the party all stood in a semicircle before Hoplite, weighed down with bags filled to bursting with food rations. There was no hunting to be done in the Fiendwood, and no kind of plant life would be edibly Broken Bar. What they carried on their backs would be all they had for the journey. Hoplite himself was weighed down with dozens of bags tied to his frame, but it was mostly just extra munitions. Lance had hoped that they would have been able to procure some horses to pull a wagon, But there would be no way for the beasts to graze on this tainted grass. No animals existed on this side of the wall that weren't cursed, and as such, no animals had been brought over. Not that anyone would dare risk bringing a horse over the treacherous mound. No, what they brought with them was all they would have to eat, for both the trip into the Fiendwood and out of it. If only there was some way to. A wagon is being brought over to this side in pieces, Hoplite said as he approached the group. I requested its acquisition from Gali, and he gave approval. Twindle furrowed her brow. Why would she began? It will be assembled, and we will load our gear onto it. Hoplite overrode her, coming to stand still as a statue before the group. Lance then began hearing mutters behind her, turning her head to see Fiendwallers and tongues both staring in awe at Hoplite. That's right, a broken bar. Hoplite was the hero of the Fiendwall now, as well as being the only mortal in history to have killed a pillar born a broken bar given enough time. His name would reach every corner of Ahkoolis. She wondered if Hoplite knew, or even cared. He didn't seem like the type to crave fame of any kind. We don't have any horses, Alistair said flatly. Just what do you expect us to do? Pull it? Negative. I will pull it, Hoplite replied in a casual monotone. You will all ride in the wagon once it's assembled. It will be faster for us to complete our objectives, and we'll be able to pack more supplies. You really think you can pull all that weight? Elam asked, baffled. Look, I know you're strong, but trying to do something like that is simply too exhausting a feat for anyone. You do realize that it will take us a month to cross the Great Bridge on foot? The Ifrit asked, shaking his horned head. You really want to drag that thing for an entire month? Negative, Hoplite replied. It will take us a maximum of 7 days. I will run. Lance couldn't hear the joke in Hoplite's tone. But a broken bar? No. Lance knew that he was completely serious. Michael himself just nodded along to what Hoplite said, apparently believing that it was completely possible. Lance herself was conflicted. A broken bar? She knew that Hoplite was practically indefatigable and insanely strong, but running across the Great Bridge in just 7 days while dragging a wagon loaded down with both people and supplies sounded like sheer madness. If Lance did not know him better, she'd have thought Hoplite was boasting. But Hoplite never boasted. Elam laughed then. I'd pay to see that. You'll collapse after just a few hours, I guarantee it. Negative, Hoplite replied flatly. Besides, we need the extra rations to survive. You say the virus a broken bar? Hoplite said, pausing for the briefest of instants before continuing. The curse can transfer to us if we eat anything from the Fiendwood? Yes, Elam nodded. Then how do you expect to make the food we have last the whole trip? It is unrealistic, Hoplite stated matter-of-factly. And you pulling a wagon for 7 days isn't? Elam asked, his tone baffled. Look, this is just the way it has to be. Negative, Hoplite replied simply, pausing briefly before saying, you'll see. Hoplite stared at the Fiendwallers as they worked, his patience straining as the men slowly assembled the wagon. It was difficult for him to just sit by and watch as the builders slowly toiled to put the vehicle together. A part of him wanted to bark orders to work faster, or to simply move in and start putting the pieces together himself. However, he held back, for Hoplite knew that the wagon would need to be assembled correctly. If that took extra time, it would be worth it. After all, if this wagon were to suffer damage from faulty construction, the results could be fatal for the entire party. Nothing in the Fiendwood was edible. Plants, animals, all of it was contaminated by the death spiral. Any water that could be found in the Fiendwood was safe to drink, at least, provided it was filtered and boiled properly. That was what Twindle thought anyway, but Hoplite wasn't sure. The Paladin was fairly certain in her theory, but had still firmly urged the party to ration the water they would bring with them. They wouldn't try filtering and boiling unless there was no other option, and if it came to that, Twindle had said she would volunteer herself to test any purified water first. As the wheels were finally being set in place, Hoplite found himself wondering if his own body would be able to filter out the curse. If it wasn't really a virus, then would his body actually be able to resist it? His throat was installed with a filter that, when activated, would purify any liquid he drank, but would it be enough? Hoplite frowned as his thoughts drifted to the Death Day celebration and how he had completely humiliated himself before the hundreds of party-goers. He should have activated that filter when the party had started. Maybe then, he wouldn't have become intoxicated. The filter did make breathing difficult when it slid into place, and with how Hoplite had been affected by the magical narcotic in the air, it had been no surprise that he never used it. When that strange peace had settled over him, the last thing on his mind had been activating the uncomfortable throat filter. Prancing around with Elvis a broken bar, Hoplite grit his teeth in irritation. When was he going to let these embarrassing memories go? There was no going back on what had happened. It was best to move on. With that thought, he turned his attention away from the wagon to instead focus on his surroundings. The center of the forward camp bustled with activity, with several fiendwallers, defenders, and tongues going about various tasks, from patrolling the perimeter and clearing rubble to bringing food and water from the untainted side of the wall. Like Hoplite himself, Twindle, Alistair, Kidka, and the rest of the party all stood around the wagon, watching it be assembled by a dozen fiendwallers that toiled and cursed as they worked. Lance seemed nervous, switching off from staring at the hill of rubble to the horizon far to the east. Was she reconsidering accompanying them on the mission? It was incredibly dangerous, and Hoplite did expect at least a few casualties among this team, either from being overwhelmed by fiends, or exposure to the curse. If she went back now a broken bar, well, Hoplite supposed that he couldn't blame her. He couldn't force her to go. It was as she told him days ago, broken bar. She wasn't his soldier. And while that was true, he still hoped that she would stick with him. Lance has proven more than capable of taking care of herself in the field. She'd not be a burden. These others though, Hoplite was unsure. It was true that they were proficient in fighting off fiends. Hoplite had learned that when they had all fought side by side during that ambush in the fjord, where fiends had poured out from the trees like a flood. Yet, that had been the only time he'd ever seen them operate in combat. There were too many unknowns with these mutants, unlike with Lance and Michael. Just how would Twindle and her friends react to a comrade dying, starvation, and other stresses? Hoplite supposed that he would find out during this operation. The fiendwallers building the wagon strained, trying to heave up the bed of the vehicle to more easily slide a wheel into place. Hoplite immediately stomped forward, lifting the bed up with a single hand as the men goggled at him. "Finish the installation," Hoplite ordered. Why yes my lord," one of the men said after a short pause. With Hoplite hefting up the wagon, the fiendwallers very quickly were able to slide the wheels in place, making sure they were firm and secure before stepping back. All right my lord, it do be done. If you can lower it we can help load your extra provisions." The man stuttered, his hands shaking slightly as he stared into Hoplite's featureless helmet. The fiendwaller's tone wasn't horrified or broken bar, it was awed. Hoplite needed to keep in mind that he had become famous for clearing out the fiends that had threatened to flood over the breach. That hadn't just been Hoplite though, the tongues had been by his side. Hoplite could not take all the credit for eliminating the threat. Maybe the man was awed because he knew that Hoplite had killed a pillarborn. Had word spread that quickly already? Hoplite then set the wagon down, slowly so as to not damage any of its parts, stepping back to admire the fiendwaller's handiwork. It was a large wagon, as Hoplite had requested, about as wide as a T-57 Rhino and was about twice as long as Hoplite was tall. The bed held more than enough room to carry the party and the extra provisions they would need for the journey. It would be incredibly heavy and difficult to move, even with a full team of horses, but not so for a Hoplite. Elam made out that Hoplite could pull the wagon across the bridge in merely a week, but Hoplite would prove him wrong. He blinked in surprise again as a new desire began plaguing his mind. For some reason a broken bar, he wanted to prove Elam wrong. It had irritated him that the red-skinned mutant had disbelieved him, and Hoplite, for whatever reason a broken bar, saw it as a sort of challenge. He knew that it was immature and unprofessional to feel this way, but Hoplite could not seem to help it. Every day that he spent out of the cold, dreamless sleep of cryo brought him closer and closer to re-embracing his human nature. Old emotions that Hoplite thought long dead were beginning to flare back to life, and immature impulses threatened to crack his steely discipline. Hoplite needed to stay diligent to ensure that wouldn't happen. The Eighth Arm could not have a Hoplite embracing their humanity like this. He was a tool to be used, a weapon against all that would bring harm to humanity. Nothing more. With that thought firmly set in his mind, Hoplite moved to the front of the wagon, hefting his bags of munitions with him as the Fiendwalders moved to put a canvas cover over the bed. The rations and weapons that they would bring had to be protected from the elements, as did the party themselves. Hoplite himself would be fine, of course. The phalanx armor and even his own skin had been installed with flexible Kelvinite piping. His body temperature couldn't drop to fatal levels, nor could he suffer from the effects of intense heat. Not that he would be exposed to intense heat. He suspected that the Fiendwood was a colder climate. When he had first laid eyes upon Ahkoolis from the Sparrow, Hoplite had seen an infected purple blotch on the lower end of the planet. With his current intel, Hoplite could surmise that it was the Fiendwood that he had seen, situated above a polar ice cap. The party seemed to have taken this into account as well, for much of what they loaded onto the cart were warm furs and thick wool cloaks. Indeed, they seemed to understand just how frigid things would become the deeper they went into the Fiendwood. All except for Alum, whose packs seemed to contain naught else but rations. Perhaps Alum's body temperature was higher than average, like Hoplite himself? If so, Hoplite would have less need to remove the phalanx armor. Alum could fulfill the role of a biological heater in Hoplite's place. Of course, utilizing body heat would be for emergencies only, but who knew just how cold it would get in the Fiendwood? Once everything was loaded onto the cart, Hoplite strode around to the front, seeing the wooden crossbar that he'd be gripping for the length of the journey. Lance climbed into the wagon bed, approaching him from behind and looking pensive. "Are you ready?" Hoplite asked her, slinging off the multitude of packs tied to his body before securing them to the coach. Lance sighed and shook her head. "I don't think I could ever be ready for this, but I'm set now," she said with finality. "I have to do it. Affirmative," Hoplite said after a short pause. What could he say to calm her nerves? "Casualties will be kept at a minimum," he told her in as reassuring a tone as he was able. Lance winced at his words, and Hoplite frowned. What had he said that elicited that reaction? "Nor we ain't gonna have no casualties," Michael said, climbing onto the bed behind her. "We're the best, ain't nobody dyin' while we're around." Hoplite disagreed. With the looming dangers of the Fiendwood, it would be impossible to keep everybody alive. Why did he lie to her that way? What was the purpose? "I hope so." Broken Bar, Lance said with a sigh. "I don't want to become a fiend of Broken Bar. That ain't gonna happen. Trust me." "The best, remember?" Michael asked her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Again, the odds of coming out of the Fiendwood without infection was unlikely. Maybe not everyone would become afflicted, but from Hoplite's estimates. Then suddenly, he understood. This was not something to be based on logic, it was about reassurance. There was value in keeping spirits high on a risky mission such as this, despite the truth of the dangers. Telling Lance that some of them would die or become infected was just the plain truth, but doing so would serve no other purpose than to demoralize her. Michael's approach was a Broken Bar. It was superior to Hoplite's, at least in regard to normal people. Hoplites and paladins always dealt with pure logic. To expect casualties when going up against the odds, they did note a Broken Bar. What was the term that was most often used for this? Ah yes, sugarcoat. Super soldiers did not sugarcoat the risks of their missions to anyone, not to standard 8th Arm infantry, and certainly not to each other. Hoplite was simply not used to such a thing. If death was likely, then it would be best to be honest about it. A Broken Bar, right? Perhaps not in this instance. From now on, he'd keep his realistic expectations to himself. The number of casualties may rise if the party came to despair. Once Hoplite was finished unloading his packs, he gripped the crossbar, waiting for everyone to load extra rations into the wagon before finally settling in themselves. When all 8 party members settled into the wagon, Hoplite turned his head. "All supplies loaded. Enough rations to make the trip?" "We have too much, I'd say," Alistair said, adjusting himself between 2 large sacks. "It's cramped back here." "Live with it," Hoplite replied. "Better safe than sorry." Alistair blew out his lips and simply nodded in response, right before slapping Theopilu's hand away from one of the ration sacks. "You ate an entire turkey just an hour ago. We have to make this last. No more extras for you," Alistair shouted, his face turning a hue of crimson. Theopolis gave a small frown before returning to his seat, shaking his head as he went. Kidka, who was seated next to the elder elf, gave a pat on Theopolis' shoulder. "Sorry, but he's right. I can't sneak you anything anymore," Kidka told Theopolis with a frown. "Maybe there's some bugs on the wagon you can munch on? Maybe a spider or termite?" At the mention of potential insects to devour, Theopolis immediately began searching, lifting up bags and peering between the seams of the planks for any unfortunate morsels. Hoplite took a deep breath as he stared out at the horizon, scanning this way and that for any approaching hordes of fiends that could be heading for the camp. There were groups of stragglers here and there, of course, all pouring across the great bridge to reach the fjord. A broken bar. Hoplite blinked as he realized that he had no idea where the great bridge was actually located. How would he find it? It would have to be located along the shore for certain, but how long would it take them to reach it? If only there was a... Hoplite berated himself for forgetting Theopolis. The elder elf had apparently lived in the Fiendwood long ago, before it was cursed. Hoplite would need Theopolis to provide directions. It was the whole reason Twindle and her friends had hired him in the first place. "Theopolis, front of the wagon," Hoplite ordered. "Point me toward the great bridge." "A broken bar," Theopolis hummed. "You are broken bar, I'll stay back here." "I don't like you." Theopolis didn't like him? Hoplite wasn't sure why, but that wasn't a factor to the mission. Theopolis needed to fulfill his role as a guide, and if he didn't do that, he would need to leave. Had Theopolis lied to Twindle about knowing the way through the Fiendwood? If that were the case, he had no purpose besides eating up needed rations. "I don't care," Hoplite said in his monotone. "Point me toward the great bridge, or get out of the wagon." Theopolis scratched his cheek before narrowing his old eyes toward the horizon. "I think if you follow the sun, you'll reach it." "You think?" Alistair shouted. "You said you knew this place like the back of your hand." "That was 2,000 years ago, boy." A broken bar. Theopolis yawned. "I just remember that it was in that general direction. When we reach the shore, you won't be able to miss it anyway." Hoplite glared at Theopolis as he finished speaking, another emotion welling within him as the elder elf settled back into his seat. Hoplite's face continued to grow hotter the longer he stared at Theopolis, the veins on his face bulging as he imagined the best way to crush the old elf's skull. Hoplite blinked again, turning his attention back to his forward-facing camera and away from Theopolis. Why did that provoke such a reaction from Hoplite? What had Theopolis done that made Hoplite's thoughts turn to murder? It wasn't natural. He'd been talked down to all his life by first-arm nobility and had not felt a thing. A broken bar. All Theopolis had done was say that he didn't like Hoplite. For some inexplicable reason a broken bar. Hoplite didn't like him either. It was strange, immature. A broken bar, even unnatural. The firm dislike for Theopolis had invaded Hoplite's mind much as the peace had during the Death Day celebration. For some reason, his blood felt hot, and not just the heat of frustration or anger, but physically hot. His skin blistered from the heat, his body regenerating the damage and leaving a tiny pit in his stomach. The Kelvinite lining his flesh fed on the excess heat, cold soon replacing it as the bionic fulfilled its purpose. Emotion alone would not have provoked such a physical reaction. A broken bar. So the question was, what had caused it? There was something strange about Theopolis. His eating habits, his behavior, not to mention how he had just now gotten Hoplite's blood to boil. A broken bar literally. In fact, Hoplite had felt this way days ago, when he'd first met Theopolis in the fjord. He'd need to interrogate the elder elf later when the opportunity presented itself. For now though, it was time to set off. Hoplite heaved the cart easily, in a slow walk at first, before breaking into a full-on sprint. The Fiendwallers, tongues, and defenders all gave whooping cheers for Hoplite, telling him to slay Kazan and to destroy the rotting alum. More intel he'd need to ask about once the day's running was completed. The 8 in the wagon all seemed to tense up as Hoplite pulled, Michael letting out a whooping "yeah" as the wagon took off. He hoped that they would be able to find more survivors from the Sparrow. A broken bar. Hoplite needed to find them, before he became a person again. Chapter 37, the last chapter. 2G struggled with himself, trying his absolute hardest to wrest back control of his body as it drew closer and closer to the elm tree that loomed over him. Every step he took was completely out of his power, as was every breath or twitch of the fingers of broken bar. It seemed that his body was lost to him. 2G had never felt this way in his life, this utter lack of control, this helplessness. It was a repulsive feeling. No matter how hard he fought, his body refused to obey his commands. His memories of what led him to this fate were hazy. The only thing that 2G could remember was that he had been defeated by Hoplite. Why was 2G not dead? He had been dead, or at least close to it, but why would Hoplite not ensure 2G's demise with a blast from one of his thunder staves? Perhaps 2G really was dead, and instead of dining in Zod's hall for eternity, he was damned to prowl the pits of Ahkoolis. If that truly were the case though, then why did the pits look like the fjord? No, 2G was not dead, though if he could not retake control of his actions, he'd soon wish he were. 2G's head then suddenly shot up of its own accord, eyes staring intently at the towering elm tree. That black pillar of wood almost completely blotted out the sun's rays, its many branches spreading out like dark fissures in the blue sky. His mouth forcefully quirked up into a smirk, and in an instant, 2G was somewhere else. His surroundings had changed from a field of midnight black soil to a circular chamber of gnarled wood. A massive glowing yellow crystal hung suspended from dozens of roots overhead, bathing the whole room in a shade of radiant gold. Where was this? How had he come to be here? Was he having some sort of strange nightmare? Several elves sat high above the chamber he stood in, seated in high-backed wooden thrones. These thrones were seemingly grown straight out of the ground and somehow seemed ornate despite their nobbly appearance. The seated elves all looked down at 2G with wide eyes, and he could easily read the surprise in their gazes. 2G would have furrowed his brow at that, had he control of his body. His Dokha was underdeveloped and weak compared to that of a full-blooded elf, and he'd rarely ever been able to read the emotions of another persona. Broken bar. So why was it so easy now? What had changed since his defeat at Hoplite's hands? "Hark, mother," 2G said, his mouth working of its own will. "Your rule has been weak and fraught with ill-made decisions." 2G continued, his finger pointing directly at a matriarchal elf woman above. So this was the Hark Mother? If that was the case, then this was most definitely the Ahkoolis Broken Bar. But why was he here? Why was 2G saying these things? Her green eyes regarded 2G as she fingered a strand of her long blonde hair. Fear was in her eyes, though she did quite a good job at concealing it outwardly. A very composed woman to resist fleeing from the ice-cold terror she felt. Perhaps she recognized 2G somehow. If she did, it could only be because he'd been described to her by the Watchers. After all, 2G had never met this woman in his life. 2G's finger lowered finally, and again, his lips quirked up in a smirk. It is time that the Ahkoolis be disbanded. Droy never set up this system of governing. It was a purely mortal decision. Therefore, I break none of his laws in overthrowing you to install a more efficient form of rule. The Hark Mother drew her lips to a tight line, glaring down at 2G with fire in her eyes, all the previous fear evaporating from the sheer heat of her rage. It was hard to believe that he had ever respected the woman. She was a fool and a coddler. 2G would have blinked in shock had he been capable of it. Respected this woman? 2G had never even met her. Where had that stream of thought come from? It was alien and the most certainly not his own. A broken bar. "We're broken bar," the Hark Mother said slowly. "We'll be gone from this place, creature. Our Lord Droy will smite you from our sight." "Mother," 2G said, cutting her off. "Droy is not going to stop me. I wouldn't have even been able to get this far, had he not wanted me to. Do you not see? This is Droy's will," he shouted, flinging his arms wide. "Look me in the eyes, Hark Mother, and know me for who I really am." A second passed, then another, as the Hark Mother peered into his eyes. The woman blinked before gasping in horror, placing a hand to her chest as her jaw hung agape. "Terlin!" the Hark Mother shouted. "How can this be?" Terlin grinned as he shoved 2G to the recesses of his mind, locking the foolish orc away as he crossed his arms. It seemed that the creature's soul had not been completely purged as Terlin had hoped. Another discovery to be marked down in his notes once his business here was concluded. This was a kind of magic that no one had attempted to use across all of preserved Historia Broken Bar, at least, not the history that common people were privy to. Terlin crossed his broad arms over his chest as he glared up at the Hark Mother, his fiery eyes boring holes into her skull. If the Harkmother didn't comply with his commands so broken bar, then Terlin may have to do just that. I had to do what was necessary, Terlin explained. With the body of this pillarborn, I will overthrow you, all of you. Terlin told them, his eyes finding each member of the Harkool. Now bow if you value your lives. I, Terlin Fireeyes, declare myself as king of the Bastion. Slay him. The Harkmother shouted at Magulian, another sitter for the hall. Magulian was a small elven man with a dangerous Dokar, being capable of slicing flesh with only his eyes. Magulian has slain countless Ahkoolis during the Expansion War, and alongside Terlin, had served as the Harkool's enforcer, should a situation such as this play out. Of course, none of the members of the hall would have ever anticipated a pillarborn coming to attack them. Terlin wanted to shock the hall into submission, not slaughter them. They were not all fools like the Harkmother, but they were certain to go against his rightful rule. There would only need to be one example made hopefully, and that example would have to be Magulian. Unfortunate, but Terlin's old friend would need to be slain, for he knew that Magulian would not back down from his duty. Magulian was one of the main reasons why Terlin had opted to take possession of 2G's body. Magulian's Dokar alone had been the only real threat to Terlin's plans, a broken bar at least before he had obtained this new body. Of course, Magulian had always been just slightly faster in activating his Dokar than Terlin had, meaning that in most scenarios, Magulian would kill Terlin before he had the chance to set him aflame. With the pillarborn's steel flesh, however, it could be resisted. Indeed, Terlin felt an invisible force strike his throat, and as Terlin had hoped, it merely glanced off his skin, a clang echoing through the chamber. He stared at Magulian, the elf showing terror in his eyes just before Terlin used his own Dokar in retaliation. In an instant, Magulian erupted in flame, and he tumbled out of his chair screaming, falling headfirst into the visitor's platform and cracking his skull open on the gnarled floor. Terlin ceased the flame in that instant, approaching the burnt body and looming over it. Surprisingly, Magulian coughed, raising a hand toward Terlin with horrified eyes. Monsieur broken bar. Magulian wheezed through burnt lips, his grey eyes desperate. I am sorry, friend. It has to be this way, Terlin said coldly before he stomped on Magulian's skull, the heel sinking into the forehead with a sickening crunch of bone. Terlin sighed as he heard 2G wailing in the back of his mind. You violate Toma, the creature shouted from the murky depths of his subconsciousness. Stop this. He huffed in irritation at the mewling voice of this body's former owner. Terlin had thought that this possession would have purged the pillarborn's consciousness completely, yet somehow it seemed that the monster's soul still held on. Perhaps it was something to do with the divine blood the orc had been born with. Terlin silenced the wretched voice again as he easily leapt to the high seats above, coming to loom over the Harkmother's throne. She flinched away, sinking back into her throne before averting her fearful gaze. So, what will it be, Mother? Terlin asked, readying his fist to deliver a killing blow to her skull. Hector leaned back in his throne with a heavy sigh, a low guttural sound that echoed throughout the empty stone chamber. There was really no need for Hector to bother with guards. None would be able to protect him better than Hector himself could. It was far less risky as well. A hired guard could easily be a spy from an enemy block lord, or an assassin paid by the gangs of the Ahkoolis to eliminate him. There have been assassins, of course. Several had come to try and slay Hector over this past decade, and all had failed. Most were dealt with by his capable servants, true, but the ones that did make it to Hector never stood a chance. His senses were just far too keen to allow any would-be killer to sneak up on him. Those very senses allowed Hector to hear the footsteps echoing outside his empty throne room, and he froze an instant before easing back into his seat. The weight of the footsteps and the distance between them indicated that it was his most trusted servant, Glenn. Hector was soon proven correct as Glenn's signature knock soon echoed from the far end of the chamber, and he grinned. Hector then sat up on his throne, quickly combing a knot from his white beard before he bellowed, "Enter Glenn." The ornately carved wooden door then slowly swung open, two other men heaving on the door to allow Glenn into the throne room. After he passed over the threshold, Glenn urged the two men to shut the doors once more. They immediately went to work, pulling the doors closed and leaving Glenn and Hector alone in the wide chamber. Glenn approached on sandaled feet, his silk cloak hanging down to trail the red carpet of the floor. A short trimmed beard framed Glenn's tanned features, and his dark eyes held a glint of mischief, even after all these years. "My master," Hector's servant said, kneeling before his throne. Hector sighed, waving for the man to stand. "What is it, Glenn?" And again, "You don't have to kneel every time you come to see me." Glenn shook his bald head as he stood from the red carpet that led to Hector's throne. "I insist, sire, you are one of Ahkoolis' block lords. As such, you are deserving of every ounce of respect I can give you." Hector sighed again before he stood to his full height, towering above Glenn by a solid 2 feet. Glenn was by no means a small man, it was just that Hector was overly massive, a result of his broken bar unorthodox upbringing. "It is a small block, and I am a humble man," Hector told Glenn, stepping down the carpeted stairs toward his servant. "Please just call me Hector." "That makes you all the more worthy of serving, my lord," Glenn said with a small smile. "I would sooner stick a knife in another lord's neck before referring to you by just your name." Hector laughed and shook his head. "Don't say that where others can hear you. You know how the serpents of this city slither in all corners." "I, my lord, a broken bar," Glenn said, bringing his voice down to a whisper. "I have news pertaining to the Starfall." Hector's golden eyes widened in surprise. "Is that so?" "I am eager to hear this news. Please speak it." Hector had been aching to learn more about the Starfall, and the moon monster that had appeared next Terna. He dearly hoped that his suspicions on what the mass could be were falsely broken bar, but until he gathered more intel, all he had to go on was a guess. "Lord my God, let me be wrong." "A man has risen from one of the fallen stars, my lord," Glenn said silently. Hector gasped. "A man? As in a human?" Glenn nodded. "Aye, my lord, a human." Hector gave a sigh of relief. Just a human, not what he had thought these A-stars might be. Though if these A-star-fallen really were human, Hector would have a different kind of problem on his hands. A broken bar. "The Star-fallen has a name, and has already earned himself quite the reputation," Glenn said, locking his fingers together. "He has destroyed an army of fiends, saving the fiend wall and likely the Feward from total annihilation, but even more impressively, if the report is accurate, then he has slain a Pillarborn as well." Hector's brows shot up in surprise. The presence of a Pillarborn meant that the end of the world was coming soon. "A broken bar, right?" He sighed and put a massive hand on Glenn's shoulder. "Thank you for your good work, Glenn. Now, you said that this Starfallen had a name? I would hear it." "Of course, my lord," Glenn said with a nod. "He goes by Hoplite." Hector's blood immediately went cold, and he backed away from Glenn with a startled gasp. "Impossible." It was impossible. Hector put a quivering hand to his face, his golden eyes seeming to shake in his skull. "His number!" Hector suddenly shouted. "What is his number, Glenn?" Glenn's eyes widened in shock, and he put his hands up in a calming gesture before saying, "I do not know what you mean, my lord. All I know is his name, not these a broken bar number." "Was he a slave?" Hector took a deep breath to steady his nerves before he clasped his hands behind his back, turning away from Glenn to stare at his throne. "Glenn, a broken bar, please leave me for a time. Please find out his number if possible." "Yeah, broken bar, I need to know." Hector rasped, tears threatening to slide down his cheeks. "I, my lord, a broken bar, be well." Glenn said slowly, "When next we speak, I hope to have the information you are asking for." Hector said nothing as Glenn left his presence, and as soon as those doors closed, his shoulders slumped. "He is a slave, Glenn, a broken bar," Hector whispered to himself, the tears freely flowing down his cheeks. "We all are a broken bar,